Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine yourself sinking slowly through layers of stone and earth, through the cool marble floors of one of the world's most sacred spaces, until you come to rest in a dim corridor far below. The air here is heavy with dust and silence. All around you in the hush lie the tombs of forgotten Romans. Mausolea line a narrow funerary road. Mosaic floors glimmer faintly in the darkness. Inscriptions carved into ancient plaster whisper names long unspoken. This is the Vatican Necropolis, a city of the dead buried 5 to 12 meters beneath St. Peter's Basilica. For centuries it lay hidden, forgotten, sealed beneath the foundations of empire and faith. Yet here, beneath all that grandeur, rest the lives of ordinary people, pagans and early Christians side by side, freedmen and children, merchants and families. How did this silent city come to be buried? What stories do these tombs still hold? And what can they teach us about memory, faith, and the fragile nature of human lives? But before we descend into the depths, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Imagine yourself standing on a hillside at the edge of ancient Rome, perhaps 2,000 years ago, in the soft light of early morning. Behind you, across the muddy waters of the Tiber River, the great city rises in layers of brick and marble, temples gleaming, voices echoing through narrow streets, the smell of smoke and bread and humanity drifting on the wind. But here, on this side of the river, the world is quieter. The land slopes gently upward, covered in scrub grass and scattered trees. There are no great monuments here, no forums or basilicas. This is Vatican Hill, and in the time of the early emperors, it was simply open ground beyond the city walls, a place of vineyards and modest estates, of silence and distance. The Romans had strict rules about death and burial. The living and the dead could not share the same space. Within the sacred boundary of the city, the Pomerium, no burials were permitted. Death was pollution, a breach of the living world's sanctity. And so the dead were carried beyond the walls, along the great roads that radiated from Rome like spokes from a wheel, to be laid in tombs that lined those roads like silent sentinels. The Via Appia, the Via Latina, the Via Flaminia all became corridors of memory, their margins crowded with mausolea, sarcophagi, urns, and inscriptions. To be remembered was to be visible, to have your name carved in stone where the living would pass and read, and speak it aloud. Vatican Hill, lying across the river and outside the walls, became one such place. It was marginal land, neither fully urban nor truly rural, a threshold space where the city's customs extended but did not quite reach. Here, families who could afford a modest tomb but not a grand monument along the major roads could lay their dead to rest. Here, freedmen and freedwomen, former slaves who had earned or bought their liberty, could establish small mausolea for themselves and their descendants. Here, the ordinary people of Rome could claim a fragment of eternity. The hill itself was not particularly distinguished. It lacked the drama of the 7 hills within Rome's embrace. It had no legendary founding, no temples to Jupiter or Juno. It was simply a slope, a piece of earth that happened to lie near enough to the city to be convenient, but far enough to be appropriate for the dead. The soil was workable. Stone could be quarried or brought in. And so, over time, as Rome grew and its population swelled, families began to build. They built small houses for the dead. Mausolea, they called them, tomb houses, structures of brick and stone designed to shelter the remains of the departed. Some were simple chambers, barely larger than a closet, with niches carved into the walls to hold cremation urns. Others were more elaborate, with vaulted ceilings, decorative stucco, mosaic floors, and room enough for multiple burials across generations. These were not the grand monuments of emperors or senators, not the towering pyramids of Cestius, or the sprawling tomb of Hadrian. These were the memorials of ordinary people built with modest means but great care. The tombs were arranged along a funerary road, a narrow path that wound up the hillside, giving access to each family's plot. Imagine walking along that road in the late afternoon, the sun slanting low, shadows lengthening. On either side, tomb facades rise, some freshly plastered and painted, others weathered and cracked. You pass inscriptions in Latin, names and ages carved into stone. Marcus Caecilius Amandus Friedman lived 35 years. Julia Tyrannia, wife and mother, aged 42. To the eternal memory of our beloved son. The words are simple, formal, repetitive, yet each one marks a life, a loss, a moment of grief rendered into stone. Inside these tombs the dead rested in various forms. Some families practiced cremation, the traditional Roman way, burning the body on a pyre and gathering the ashes into an urn, which was then placed in a niche within the tomb. Others, influenced perhaps by changing customs or personal preference, chose inhumation, laying the body intact in a sarcophagus or a loculus, a rectangular slot carved into the tomb wall. Over time, as Christianity began to spread through Rome, inhumation became more common, reflecting a belief in bodily resurrection that made cremation seem inappropriate. But in the early centuries of the empire, both practices coexisted, sometimes even within the same tomb, as families adapted to new ideas while honouring old traditions. The necropolis on Vatican Hill grew slowly, organically, over generations. It was not planned by any central authority, not laid out with the geometric precision of a Roman military camp. Instead, it expanded as individual families purchased plots, built tombs, and claimed their small piece of ground. The result was a crowded, irregular landscape of memory, a silent suburb of the dead that mirrored, in its own way, the living neighbourhoods across the river, and it was truly a place apart. Few came here except on the occasions of burial or commemoration. On certain days, families would cross the river to visit their ancestors' tombs, bringing offerings of food and wine, speaking prayers, or simply sitting in quiet remembrance. But most of the time, the hillside lay undisturbed, populated only by the dead and the occasional watchman or caretaker. The sounds of the city faded to a distant murmur. The air smelled of earth and stone. Time moved differently here, measured not in hours but in seasons, in the slow weathering of inscriptions, in the gradual accumulation of dust. This was the world into which the necropolis was born, not a place of drama or legend, but a practical solution to a universal human need. A place to lay the dead, a place to remember, a place finally where ordinary lives could leave their mark, however small, upon the earth. And it was here, in this quiet, unremarkable hillside cemetery, that history would later inscribe meanings no one in those early days could have imagined. The tombs that rose along Vatican Hill were not caves or catacombs, not the dark labyrinths that would later honeycomb the earth beneath Rome's countryside. They were structures built under open sky, visible monuments meant to be seen, to be visited, to proclaim the memory of the dead to anyone who passed. This was the Roman way, the pagan tradition of commemorating death not through concealment, but through display, through the careful architecture of remembrance. Picture one of these mausolea as it might have appeared in the 2nd century of the Common Era. A small rectangular building, perhaps 4 meters wide and 5 meters deep, constructed of brick and stone. The facade faces the funerary road, its entrance framed by pillars or simple moulding, the lintel above carved with an inscription. The walls are covered in plaster, painted in ochre or red or pale cream. A peaked roof, now weathered, once shed rainwater away from the precious contents within. Step inside, in your imagination, through the narrow doorway. The interior is dim, lit only by whatever sunlight filters through the entrance or through small openings near the ceiling. The air is cool, dry, heavy with the faint smell of stone and earth. The walls around you are decorated not lavishly but with care. Stucco work forms geometric patterns or simple floral motifs. In some tombs, painted plaster depicts vines, birds, garlands of flowers, symbols of abundance and eternal life drawn from the visual vocabulary of pagan Rome. The floor beneath your feet might be plain-packed, earth, or it might be paved with small tiles arranged in modest mosaics. Simple patterns mostly, checkerboards or meanders, though occasionally something more elaborate, a peacock perhaps, or dolphins leaping through stylized waves. These images were not merely decorative, they carried meaning, drawn from a shared cultural language that every Roman would have understood. The peacock symbolized immortality, its flesh believed not to decay. The dolphin guided souls across the waters to the afterlife. The vine represented Dionysus, god of wine and rebirth, whose sacred plant died each winter only to surge back to life each spring. Along the walls, you see niches carved into the masonry, rectangular openings perhaps 1/2 meter tall and wide receding into darkness. These are columbaria, dovecote niches, designed to hold cremation urns. Each niche might contain 1 or 2 urns, vessels of clay or stone or occasionally glass, sealed to protect the ashes within. Some urns are plain, functional. Others are decorated with inscriptions giving the name of the deceased, their age, perhaps a brief epitaph. Here rests the ashes of Gaius Valerius Felix Friedmann, who lived well and died peacefully in his 60th year. In other tombs, instead of niches, you find arcosolia, arched recesses in the walls large enough to hold a body laid out in full. These are inhumation burials, the body placed in a sarcophagus or simply wrapped in cloth and laid on a stone shelf within the arched space. The front of the arcosolia might be sealed with a marble slab, inscribed with the name and dates of the person within. Or it might remain open, the body visible to visitors, a reminder of mortality and the fate that awaits all flesh. Some tombs held only a handful of burials, a single family's immediate dead. Others, over time, accumulated dozens of urns and bodies, generation after generation adding to the collective resting place. The wealthiest tombs might include a small altar or table where offerings could be placed, cups of wine poured out, bread broken, and left for the spirits of the departed. These rituals were ancient, rooted in the belief that the dead, though gone from the world of the living, still required sustenance, still appreciated remembrance, still existed in some shadowy realm beyond the threshold of death. The inscriptions are everywhere, carved into stone, painted onto plaster, scratched hastily into brickwork. They speak in formulaic phrases, the conventional language of Roman funerary commemoration. Dis manibus, they often begin, to the spirits of the dead. Then the name, the age, perhaps a profession or a relationship. Marcus Antonius Primus, freedman and cloth merchant, aged 49, erected by his grieving wife Julia. To the eternal memory of our daughter Flavia, taken from us in her 12th year. The words are worn smooth by time, but their meaning endures, simple statements of love and loss repeated in tomb after tomb, a chorus of grief echoing down the centuries. What strikes you, standing here in this imagined space, is the ordinariness of it all. These are not the tombs of heroes or emperors, not monuments to military conquest or political power. They are the resting places of shopkeepers and scribes, weavers and potters, former slaves who had earned their freedom and wanted, in death, to be remembered as citizens, as individuals, as people who had mattered. The very act of building a tomb, of carving a name into stone, was an assertion of dignity, a refusal to be forgotten, a small rebellion against the vast indifference of time. The necropolis grew organically, each family adding its structure to the landscape, until the hillside became crowded with these small monuments. There was no grand plan, no architect's vision imposing order. Instead, the tombs jostled for space, their walls sometimes sharing common foundations, their doorways opening onto the same narrow path. It was an architecture of accumulation, of incremental memory, reflecting the slow, patient work of generations. And it was diverse. Not all tombs looked the same. Some were simple, almost austere, a single chamber with a few niches and an inscription. Others were more elaborate, with vaulted ceilings, painted frescoes, separate rooms for different branches of the family. The materials varied too, depending on what each family could afford. Some tombs were built entirely of brick, others incorporated stone blocks or recycled architectural fragments. The decorations ranged from crude to refined, from hasty paint daubs to carefully executed mosaics. What united them all was purpose. These were houses for the dead, built with the same care and attention that the living lavished on their own homes. They were meant to last, to provide shelter and dignity for the remains within, to stand as visible markers of lives lived and mourned. And for centuries they did exactly that, silent guardians on a hillside beyond the river, holding memory in stone and earth while the great city nearby churned with life. Sometime in the late 2nd century, perhaps around the year 180 or 190, a subtle shift began to ripple through the necropolis on Vatican Hill. The tombs still stood as they always had, their brick facades weathering slowly in the rain and sun, their interiors still receiving the dead. but the dead themselves were changing. Or rather, the beliefs of those who laid them to rest were evolving in ways that would transform not only this hillside cemetery, but the entire fabric of Roman civilization. Christianity had come to Rome. It arrived quietly, carried by travellers and merchants, spreading through whispered conversations in workshops and markets, taking root first among the poor, the slaves, the freedmen, those whose lives offered little comfort in the present, and who found solace in promises of resurrection and eternal life. For decades, it remained a marginal sect, one religion among many in a city that had always made room for foreign gods. The authorities viewed it with suspicion when they noticed it at all. Occasionally there were persecutions, moments of violence when political needs demanded a scapegoat. But mostly Christianity grew in the shadows, patient and persistent, waiting. By the end of the 2nd century, Christian communities existed throughout Rome, including in the neighbourhoods across the Tiber from Vatican Hill, and when Christians died, they too needed somewhere to rest. Some were buried in the great catacombs that honeycomb the countryside around Rome, those famous underground labyrinths of narrow passages and burial niches. But others, particularly those with means or family connections to existing tomb sites, found their way into the older established cemeteries, into places like the Necropolis on Vatican Hill. Here, then, is where the story becomes complicated, where simple categories begin to blur. A freedman family that had built a tomb in the mid-2nd century, when they were still worshippers of the traditional Roman gods, might by the end of that century include members who had converted to Christianity. When those Christian family members died, they were laid to rest in the family tomb, alongside pagan grandparents and great-grandparents. The tomb did not change ownership. The inscriptions on its facade remained the same, but inside new elements appeared. A Christian burial might be marked by different symbols carved into the plaster, near the niche or arcosolium where the body lay. A fish, perhaps, the ancient Christian symbol whose Greek letters spelled out a secret creed. An anchor, representing hope. A dove with an olive branch. The Chi-Rho monogram, combining the first letters of Christ's name in Greek. These symbols were often small, discreet, added quietly to walls that already bore the traditional Roman decorations of garlands and peacocks and vine leaves. The inscriptions changed too, subtly at first. Where a pagan epitaph might have read, "To the spirits of the dead, Gaius Valerius rests here," a Christian inscription might say, "Gaius Valerius at peace in Christ," or "Here sleeps in peace Marcus, who awaits the resurrection." The formula "in peace," became a marker of Christian belief. A quiet assertion of faith in a life beyond death that was not the shadowy underworld of pagan tradition, but a promised paradise. Yet the transformation was rarely complete or sudden. Many tombs show evidence of both pagan and Christian practices existing side by side, not in conflict, but in a kind of uneasy coexistence. A tomb might contain cremation urns from earlier generations alongside inhumation burials of later Christian family members. The walls might display both traditional Roman funerary art and Christian symbols. An inscription might invoke the old gods while also mentioning Christ. This was a world in transition, a moment when old certainties were dissolving, but new ones had not yet fully taken their place. Archaeologists call this phenomenon syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions, and it was everywhere in the late Roman world. People did not simply abandon one set of beliefs and adopt another overnight. Instead, they adapted, they compromised, they held multiple ideas simultaneously, trying to navigate a changing spiritual landscape while honouring the memory of their ancestors and the traditions of their families. A Christian might still participate in family rituals at a pagan tomb because those rituals honoured parents and grandparents, because to refuse would be to break the bonds of family and memory that held society together. The Necropolis on Vatican Hill became, in this period, a kind of palimpsest, a manuscript where new text was written over old without entirely erasing what had come before. Walk through it in your imagination now, in the year 220 perhaps, and you see this layering everywhere. An old tomb with pagan inscriptions, but a new burial marked with a fish symbol. A recently built mausoleum that incorporates both traditional Roman architectural elements and the newer Christian preference for inhumation over cremation. Graffiti scratched into plaster, prayers to Christ added beside older prayers to the manes, the protective spirits of the dead. What matters here is not simply that Christians began to use the necropolis, but how they used it. They did not build a separate Christian cemetery. did not wall themselves off from their pagan neighbours. Instead, they wove their presence into the existing fabric of the place, adding their voices to a chorus that had been singing for generations. They adapted the physical spaces of pagan tombs to serve Christian needs. They reinterpreted symbols, giving new meanings to old images. The vine that had represented Dionysus could now represent Christ, who called himself the true vine. The peacock that had symbolized immortality in pagan thought could symbolize resurrection in Christian theology. This was not conquest or replacement, but transformation, a slow, organic process driven not by imperial decree or theological debate, but by the simple needs of ordinary people trying to honor their dead according to their evolving beliefs while remaining connected to their families and their past. The necropolis did not become Christian. It became something more complex, a space where multiple ways of understanding death and memory and the sacred could coexist, overlapping and influencing each other in ways that made simple categorization impossible. And so the tombs continued to fill, year after year, generation after generation, holding within them the remains of pagans and Christians alike, all resting together in the cool earth of Vatican Hill, waiting in silence for a future none of them could have imagined. Imagine yourself walking now along that ancient funerary road, the Via Cornelia perhaps, or simply one of those unnamed paths that wound through the necropolis in the 3rd century of the Common Era. The sun hangs low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the hillside. On either side of you, tomb facades rise like a row of silent houses, their doorways dark rectangles leading into deeper darkness. The air is still, heavy with the scent of dry earth and stone. Your footsteps raise small puffs of dust that hang suspended in the slanting light. This is the necropolis at its fullest extent, a city of the dead that has grown over generations into a dense landscape of memory. The tombs press close together now, their walls sometimes sharing foundations, their small plots of ground packed tightly along the narrow road. There is a geometry here, an accidental urban planning born not from any master architect's vision, but from the accumulated decisions of hundreds of families over hundreds of years. Each tomb represents a claim on eternity, a refusal to be forgotten, a small assertion of permanence in a world of flux and change. Walk slowly and let your eyes adjust to the details. Here, on your right, stands a mausoleum with a peaked roof and a facade decorated in fading red plaster. The inscription above the doorway reads, "The Tomb of the Cateni," a family name you do not recognize, freedmen perhaps, or merchants, people who made their modest fortune in trade and wanted their memory preserved in stone. The doorway is low, forcing you to duck slightly if you were to enter. Inside you would find niches lining the walls, each one holding an urn, each urn containing the ashes of someone who once walked these same paths, breathed this same air, felt the warmth of this same sun on their skin. A few steps further, another tomb, this one larger, more elaborate. The facade is decorated with stucco work, geometric patterns that frame the entrance. Through the doorway you catch a glimpse of mosaic floor, small tiles arranged in a simple repeating pattern of black and white. The walls inside are painted, though the colours have faded to ghostly pastels, hints of what must once have been vibrant reds and blues and yellows. You see the shapes of painted garlands, perhaps a bird in flight, decorative elements meant to beautify this final resting place. And here, tucked between two larger structures, a smaller tomb, barely more than a chamber carved into the hillside and fronted with a simple brick wall. The inscription is crude, the letters irregularly spaced and roughly carved, suggesting a family with limited means who nonetheless wanted to provide their dead with proper burial. "Marcus and Julia, rest in peace," it says, using that Christian formula, "in pace," that marks this as a later addition to the necropolis, a tomb built or reused when Christianity had already begun to spread through Rome's population. The road continues, winding gently uphill, and with each step you pass more tombs. They begin to blur together after a while, these monuments to forgotten lives, yet each one was desperately important to someone. Each one represented years of saving, careful planning, negotiation for a plot of ground, the hiring of builders and craftsmen, the selection of materials, the composition of an inscription that would capture in a few words the essence of a life lived. These were not casual constructions. They were investments in memory, attempts to bridge the terrible gulf between life and death, between presence and absence, between the warmth of human existence and the cold finality of the grave. Archaeological evidence suggests that within a stretch of perhaps 100 metres of this funerary road, there stood approximately 22 separate tomb buildings. Some were simple single-chamber structures, others were more complex with multiple rooms, vaulted ceilings, elaborate decorative programs. Together, these tombs likely held the remains of around 1,000 individuals, perhaps more. 1,000 names, 1,000 lives, 1,000 stories of birth and work and love and death, all compressed into this small slice of hillside, this narrow corridor of memory. Think about that number for a moment. 1,000 people. If you tried to meet them all, to shake each hand, to learn each name, it would take you hours. If you tried to hear their stories, to understand their hopes and fears, their joys and sorrows, you could spend months or years and still barely scratch the surface. Yet here they all are, or were, reduced to ashes and bones, to inscriptions and symbols, to the mute testimony of stone and earth. The tombs tell you who they were, or try to. The inscriptions give names, ages, sometimes occupations or relationships. Gaius Valerius, freedman and grain merchant, aged 47 years. Cornelia Severa, beloved wife and mother, died in her 33rd year. To the memory of our son Quintus, taken from us at age 9. The formulae are repetitive, conventional, but within them you catch glimpses of real people. A merchant who worked with grain, loading and unloading sacks from riverboats, calculating prices, haggling with customers. A wife and mother whose life revolved around home and family, who bore children, managed a household, died young by any measure. A boy of 9, barely begun in life, mourned by parents whose grief poured itself into stone. Many of the dead were freedmen and freedwomen, former slaves who had earned or purchased their liberty, and now, in death, wanted to be remembered not as property but as individuals, as citizens, as people with names and identities and family connections. Their tombs are assertions of personhood, declarations that their lives mattered, that they deserved to be mourned and remembered just as much as those born free. In a society built on hierarchy and status, these modest monuments represent small acts of dignity, quiet rebellions against the forces that would reduce human beings to commodities. There were children here too, buried alongside parents and grandparents, small niches holding small urns, or tiny sarcophagi carved with images of childhood, toys and pets and games. The mortality rate in ancient Rome was brutal, especially for the young. Many children died before reaching their 5th birthday, victims of disease, malnutrition, accidents, the 1,000 casual cruelties of a world without modern medicine or sanitation. Their presence in the necropolis is a reminder of how precarious life was, how close death always stood, how grief was woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Step inside one of these tombs now, in your imagination, and let your eyes adjust to the dimness. The air is cooler here, insulated from the heat of the day by thick brick walls. Dust motes drift in the shaft of light that falls through the doorway, settling slowly onto surfaces that have remained undisturbed for centuries. You stand in a chamber perhaps 4 meters square, with a vaulted ceiling that rises to a gentle arch overhead. The walls around you are not bare stone but covered in a thin skin of plaster, and on that plaster faint traces of colour still cling. Look closely at the floor beneath your feet. It is not packed earth but a mosaic, small tesserae of stone and fired clay arranged in geometric patterns. The design is simple, a border of twisted rope motif framing a central field of repeating squares, each square containing a small flower or rosette. The colours have faded over time, but you can still make out shades of cream and ochre, dark red and pale blue. Someone chose these colours, selected these stones, arranged them with care into this pattern. Someone knelt here perhaps, setting tile after tile, building up this small work of beauty that would lie beneath the feet of mourners, that would form the foundation for urns and sarcophagi, that would endure long after the hands that made it had themselves turned to dust. The walls tell their own stories. The plaster is painted, though the paint has deteriorated badly, flaking away in places to reveal the rough brick beneath. Still, enough remains to suggest what once was. Here, on the wall to your left, you can make out the ghostly outline of a painted garland, a wreath of flowers and leaves that loops across the surface in an elegant curve. The Romans loved such decorations, these symbols of abundance and celebration, of life's pleasures extended even into death. The garland would have been brightly coloured once, vivid greens and reds and golds, but now it is barely visible, a memory of colour on a faded surface. On another wall you see traces of a different kind of decoration. Stucco work, not merely painted but sculpted, low-relief patterns pressed into wet plaster and then painted. You can still feel the texture if you run your hand gently across the surface, the slight variations in depth that create patterns of light and shadow. Vine leaves, perhaps, or the repetitive geometric borders that Romans favoured, meanders and key patterns and interlocking circles. These decorations were not unique to this tomb. They were part of a shared visual vocabulary, motifs that appeared in houses and temples and public buildings throughout the Roman world, brought into the tomb as a way of making this space for the dead feel familiar, domesticated, a continuation of the world of the living rather than a stark departure from it. The ceiling too bears decoration, though it is harder to see in the dim light. Coffered panels, perhaps, or a painted design that once gave the illusion of a decorated vault. Some tombs had ceilings adorned with stars, representations of the heavens to which the soul would ascend. Others showed birds in flight, symbols of the spirit's liberation from the body. Still others displayed more abstract patterns, reminding viewers that even in death there was order, pattern, continuity, with the world left behind. But it is the contents of the tomb that draw your attention most powerfully. Along the walls you see the niches, the columbaria, arranged in rows at different heights. Some are empty now, their urns removed or destroyed over the centuries. Others still hold vessels, simple clay pots or more elaborate marble containers, sealed and silent. Each urn once received the ashes of a person, gathered from the funeral pyre, and carefully deposited here in this permanent home. The process of cremation was elaborate, ritualized, meant to transform the body from flesh to purified essence, to release the spirit while preserving something tangible that could be kept, mourned over, visited. In other parts of the tomb you see the arcosolia, those arched recesses that hold full-body burials. Some contain sarcophagi, stone coffins carved with decorative elements. One shows a pastoral scene, shepherds tending flocks, a common motif that could be read as either pagan or Christian, a reminder of bucolic peace or an allegory of Christ as the Good Shepherd. Another sarcophagus is simpler, its surface inscribed only with the name and age of the deceased, a woman named Flavia who died at 28, leaving behind a husband and 2 small children whose grief is recorded in the brief epitaph carved below her name. The inscriptions are everywhere, not just on sarcophagi but carved directly into the plaster walls, etched into marble plaques, sometimes even scratched hastily into soft stone or brick. They speak in the formal language of Roman commemoration, but occasionally a more personal note breaks through. To my dearest wife, who was my light in life and whose absence is my darkness in death. Here rests a faithful friend, honest in dealings, generous in spirit, mourned by all who knew him. Sleep well, little one, free now from pain. These fragments of feeling, compressed into stone, are among the most moving artifacts the necropolis contains. The decorative program of each tomb, its mosaics and paintings and sculptures, its inscriptions and architectural details, all served multiple purposes. They beautified the space, making it worthy of the dead who rested there. They proclaimed the status and taste of the family who owned the tomb, demonstrating that even in death they understood proper Roman sensibilities. They provided comfort to the living, creating an environment that felt less like a hole in the earth and more like a dignified chamber, a room where the dead could rest in peace and the living could come to remember without horror. But these decorations also served a more practical function. They marked identity. The specific choices of imagery, the particular symbols and motifs, told visitors something about who lay here. Certain professions had their own iconography. Merchants might be depicted with ships or bales of goods. Craftsmen might have tools carved into their monuments. Soldiers might have weapons or military scenes. Women might be shown with children or household implements, defining their identity through their roles as mothers and managers of domestic space. And increasingly, as Christianity spread, the decorations began to shift, incorporating new symbols alongside old ones. The fish, the anchor, the Chiro monogram, the image of the Good Shepherd, all appeared in tombs that also contained traditional Roman motifs. This was the visual language of transition, of a world caught between old certainties and new promises, expressed not in theological treatises but in the humble decoration of burial chambers, in the careful choices of grieving families trying to honour their dead according to evolving beliefs about what death meant and what, if anything, lay beyond it. Let us return now to the broader landscape of the necropolis and consider what it meant for pagans and Christians to share these burial grounds in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. This is not a story often told in histories that prefer clear narratives of conflict and conversion, of one religion displacing another in dramatic fashion. The reality on Vatican Hill was far more nuanced, far more human, and in many ways more interesting than any tale of simple replacement. Picture a family, perhaps in the year 240, gathered at their ancestral tomb for the commemoration of a death anniversary. The family patriarch, an old man now, remembers when this tomb was built by his grandfather, when it held only the ashes of pagan ancestors, when the rituals performed here invoked the traditional gods of Rome. But times have changed. His own children have converted to Christianity, drawn by the promise of resurrection, by the appeal of a faith that offered hope to the poor and marginalized, that spoke of a kingdom beyond the hierarchies of Roman society. Now, when the family gathers, they perform rituals that blend old and new. They pour libations of wine, an ancient practice that predates Christianity by millennia. They speak prayers, but some family members address Christ while others still invoke the manes, the protective spirits of the dead. They bring flowers and food, offerings that serve both traditions. The old man does not understand his children's new faith, not really, but he loves them, and they love him, and in death as in life, love finds a way to bridge divides that doctrine cannot. This scene, or countless variations of it, played out across the necropolis throughout the 3rd century. Christianity was spreading, but it spread through families, through social networks, through personal relationships, not through imperial decree or organized missionary campaigns. A slave might convert and then gradually bring other members of his household into the faith. A merchant travelling to Egypt or Syria might encounter Christian communities there and return to Rome with new beliefs. A wife might convince her husband, or a husband his wife, or children their parents, or more often parents their children. And as families converted gradually and unevenly, they brought their new faith into spaces that had been created for older beliefs. They did not abandon their ancestral tombs. They did not dig new cemeteries and isolate themselves from their pagan relatives. Instead, they adapted the spaces they already had, adding Christian symbols to pagan tombs, reinterpreting old decorations through new theological lenses, finding ways to make these burial chambers serve both the dead already interred there and those who would join them in years to come. The result was a necropolis of extraordinary religious diversity, a place where multiple worldviews coexisted in stone and plaster. Walk along the funerary road in the mid-3rd century and you would see tomb after tomb displaying this mixture. Here, a mausoleum with purely pagan imagery, its owner still devoted to the traditional gods. There, a tomb with purely Christian symbols, belonging perhaps to a family that had converted generations ago and had no pagan ancestors to accommodate. And between them, dozens of tombs that showed both traditions, that spoke in multiple religious languages simultaneously. This was not, it is important to understand, a situation of perfect harmony. There were tensions. Some pagans viewed Christianity with suspicion or hostility, seeing it as a foreign superstition that threatened Roman traditions. Some Christians rejected pagan practices entirely, refusing to participate in family rituals they viewed as idolatrous. There were families torn apart by religious differences, children disowned by parents, marriages strained or broken. But the necropolis itself suggests that accommodation was more common than conflict, that most people found ways to negotiate religious differences within families and communities. The very fact that Christian and pagan burials share the same tombs, that Christian symbols appear alongside pagan ones in the same decorative programs, tells us that somehow, despite theological incompatibilities, people were making it work. Part of this accommodation was possible because both traditions shared certain fundamental assumptions about death and burial. Both believed the dead deserved respect and proper burial. Both believed in some form of afterlife, even if they disagreed about its nature. Both used burial as an opportunity to express social identity, family connections, and personal values. The physical practices of burial, the rituals of mourning, the material culture of tombs, all these provided common ground even when theological beliefs diverged. Moreover, for most ordinary people, religious identity was not the totalizing, all-consuming thing it would later become. A person could be a Christian and still participate in civic festivals that had pagan origins. A person could honor the traditional gods and still be curious about Christian teachings. Identity was flexible, multiple, situational. The rigid categories that later theological debates would impose, the insistence that one must be either pagan or Christian with no middle ground, had not yet hardened into the absolute boundaries they would become. The necropolis on Vatican Hill thus becomes a kind of laboratory for understanding religious change in the ancient world. It shows us that conversion was not an event but a process, not a clean break, but a gradual transformation. It shows us that religious communities were not isolated from each other but deeply intertwined through family ties, economic relationships, and shared social spaces. It shows us that the Christian church that would eventually dominate Western civilization did not spring fully formed from the teachings of Christ or the writings of Paul, but emerged gradually through centuries of negotiation, adaptation, and synthesis with the cultures it encountered. And it reminds us, perhaps most importantly, that the people buried here were not historical abstractions, not mere representatives of broad religious movements, but individuals with complex identities, divided loyalties, and personal struggles. They were trying to honor both their ancestors and their new beliefs, to maintain family unity while following their consciences, to find meaning in death while navigating a world of religious change. They were, in short, human beings doing what human beings have always done, trying to make sense of mortality and loss using whatever symbolic resources their culture provides. The tombs they left behind, with their mixed iconography and their layered meanings, stand as testimony to that struggle. They are not monuments to religious purity, but to religious complexity, not celebrations of triumphant faith, but quiet acknowledgements of how difficult it is to live between worlds, to honor multiple traditions, to love people who believe differently than you do. In their modest way, these tombs are more honest about the human condition than any grand basilica or theological treatise, because they admit what those later constructions often denied, that belief is complicated, that identity is multiple, that the sacred can speak in many voices at once. But who were these people whose remains filled the necropolis? What lives did they lead before death brought them to rest in these modest tombs on Vatican Hill? The inscriptions carved into stone and plaster offer fragmentary answers, brief glimpses into identities that have otherwise vanished into time. Each name, each age, each brief notation of profession or relationship represents a thread connecting us across 2,000 years to individual human experiences. Many of those buried here were freedmen and freedwomen, people who had been born into slavery or sold into it, but who had somehow earned or purchased their liberty. The Latin inscriptions make this clear, using the designation libertus or liberta to mark their status. Gaius Valerius Felix, freedman of Gaius, lived 62 years. The formula is simple, formulaic even, but it tells us something important. This man, Felix, had been enslaved, had belonged to another man named Gaius, and at some point had been granted his freedom. He lived long enough to grow old, to perhaps establish himself in some trade or business, to save enough money to secure a burial plot in this necropolis. The very fact that freed people could afford tombs here speaks to the economic possibilities of imperial Rome, to the ways that even people who began life in bondage could sometimes accumulate modest wealth. Not all freed people did, of course. Many remained desperately poor, struggling at the margins of survival. But those who succeeded, who climbed from slavery to freedom to modest prosperity, often invested heavily in their tombs, wanting in death to be remembered not as former slaves, but as Roman citizens, as people with names and families and dignity. The inscriptions sometimes provide more than just names and legal status. They give ages, and those ages paint a sobering picture of mortality in the ancient world. You see children everywhere in the necropolis. Julia Crescentia, who lived 3 years and 8 months. Marcus Antonius' sweet child, taken from us at age 7. Flavia Domitilla, daughter, died in her 2nd year. The grief embedded in these brief notations is almost unbearable. Parents outliving children, the natural order inverted, small bodies placed in tombs meant to hold generations. But there are also the old, people who by ancient standards lived remarkably long lives. Cornelia Severa, who reached her 85th year. Publius Aelius, veteran and grandfather, aged 79. These were survivors, people who had weathered the diseases, the accidents, the sheer grinding difficulty of life in antiquity. Their long lives were remarkable enough that their ages were recorded with what seems like pride, a testament to endurance. Some inscriptions note professions or trades. Here rests a grain merchant, there a cloth seller, over there a scribe or accountant. These were not aristocrats or senators, not the people whose names appear in historical chronicles or whose deeds shape the course of empires. They were the working people of Rome, those who ran shops and workshops, who moved goods through the city's markets, who kept the vast machinery of urban life functioning through their daily labour. Women's identities in the Necropolis are almost always defined through relationships. Beloved wife of Marcus, devoted mother of 3 children, daughter of Gaius and Flavia. This reflects the social reality of Roman life, where women's legal and social identities were subsumed into those of fathers, husbands and sons. Yet occasionally you catch glimpses of women who had other identities as well. Here and there an inscription mentions a woman as a midwife, a wet nurse, a hairdresser, trades that provided income and perhaps a degree of independence. The names themselves are revealing. Many are thoroughly Roman, the standard 3-part names of Roman citizens: prenomen, nomen, and cognomen. But others show foreign origins, Greek names or names from Egypt or Syria or Gaul, marking their bearers as immigrants or descendants of immigrants, people who had come to Rome from across the Mediterranean world. The empire was cosmopolitan, drawing people from hundreds of different cultures and backgrounds into its capital, and the Necropolis reflects that diversity. Family relationships thread through the inscriptions like veins through marble. Erected by his grieving widow, set up by loving children to the best of parents, to our brother, gone too soon. These formulaic phrases, repeated tomb after tomb, reveal the emotional architecture of Roman life, the ways that identity and meaning were constructed through kinship bonds. To be remembered was to be remembered as someone's son or daughter, someone's husband or wife, someone's parent or sibling. Individual identity was inseparable from one's place in a web of family relationships. The sheer number of people buried here, that figure of perhaps 1,000 individuals in a relatively small section of the Necropolis, invites contemplation. 1,000 people. Try to imagine them all alive, moving through Rome's streets, conducting business, raising families, quarrelling and reconciling, celebrating festivals, worrying about money and health and the future. Try to imagine the accumulated hours of lived experience represented by that number, the millions of moments of consciousness, the vast ocean of thoughts and feelings and perceptions that constituted their lives. All of that is gone now, of course, reduced to bones and ashes, to brief inscriptions, to the mute testimony of tomb architecture. But once, each of these 1,000 people was as real, as complex, as fully present to themselves as you are to yourself now. Each had an inner life as rich and detailed as yours, filled with hopes and fears, memories and dreams, the whole intricate machinery of human consciousness. Each was the centre of their own universe, the protagonist of their own story, and each story ended here, in a tomb on Vatican Hill, with a few words carved into stone to mark their passing. What united all these diverse individuals, these people of different ages and professions and origins and beliefs, was simply their humanity and their mortality. They were born, they lived, they died, and those who loved them wanted their memory preserved. In this, they were no different from people in any age or culture. The human need to be remembered, to leave some mark upon the world that persists beyond the brief span of biological life, seems to be universal, woven into the very fabric of what it means to be human. The Necropolis, then, is not really about death at all, but about love. About the love of children for parents, of parents for children, of husbands for wives and wives for husbands, of siblings for each other, of friends for friends. It is love that motivated people to spend precious resources on tombs and inscriptions, love that brought them back year after year to tend graves and perform rituals, love that insisted these particular lives, these particular people, mattered enough to be remembered. To understand the Necropolis on Vatican Hill, to grasp what it meant to the people who built it and used it, we must step back and consider Roman attitudes toward death itself, the complex web of beliefs and practices that governed how people in the ancient world understood mortality, and what, if anything, came after. This is not a simple story of one unified belief system, but rather a tapestry of ideas, some very old, some newly imported, many coexisting in tension and contradiction. Traditional Roman religion, the paganism that had structured life in the city for centuries, did not offer clear or comforting answers about the afterlife. There was a shadowy underworld, yes, a realm ruled by Pluto and Proserpina, where the dead resided in dim eternity. But this was not a place of reward or punishment, not a realm where the virtuous received their due or the wicked faced justice. It was simply where the dead went, all of them, regardless of how they had lived. The shades that inhabited this underworld were pale shadows of their former selves, drained of vitality and consciousness, existing in a state that was barely existence at all. For most Romans, then, true immortality was not about the afterlife, but about memory. To be remembered, to have your name spoken by the living, to be honoured at your tomb with offerings and prayers. This was the closest thing to continued existence that one could hope for. The tomb was not merely a repository for remains, but a permanent address, a place where the living could maintain contact with the dead, where family bonds could persist across the boundary of death. This is why tombs were built along roads, why they were designed to be seen, why inscriptions proclaimed names and deeds to passers-by. Stranger, stop and read, many epitaphs began, calling out to travellers, asking them to pause and acknowledge that here once lived a person whose life mattered. Every time someone read the inscription aloud, spoke the name, the dead person achieved a small resurrection, a momentary return to the world of sound and speech and human consciousness. The rituals performed at tombs reinforced this connection between living and dead. On the anniversary of a death, family members would gather at the tomb to perform commemorative rites. They poured libations of wine onto the ground, allowing it to seep down into the earth where they imagined it might somehow reach the dead below. They left offerings of food, bread and eggs, and honey cakes, as if the dead still needed sustenance. They burned incense, whose smoke rose toward the heavens, carrying prayers or simply the presence of the living to whatever realm the dead now inhabited. These practices were ancient, rooted in beliefs about the manes, the spirits of the dead, who were thought to have some kind of continued existence, some ability to influence the world of the living. The manes needed to be honoured, appeased, kept content, or they might bring misfortune to their descendants. Neglecting the dead was not just disrespectful but dangerous, a violation of the fundamental obligations that bound families together across generations. But by the time our necropolis was at its height, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, these traditional beliefs were being challenged and supplemented by newer ideas, particularly those flowing from the Eastern Mediterranean. Mystery religions, cults that promised initiates special knowledge and special fates after death, had become popular in Rome. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, offered visions of resurrection and continued life. The mysteries of Mithras, popular especially among soldiers, promised salvation and ascent through cosmic spheres to the realm of the gods. The followers of Dionysus believed in cycles of death and rebirth, the god himself a model for how life could triumph over mortality. These mystery religions offered what traditional Roman paganism did not: hope for something better after death, a promise that the ending of biological life was not the ending of everything, that consciousness and identity might persist in some meaningful way. For people whose lives were difficult, who faced poverty or slavery or simply the grinding hardships of pre-modern existence, these promises had powerful appeal. And then there was Christianity, which by the 3rd century was spreading rapidly through all levels of Roman society. Christianity made even bolder claims than the mystery religions. It promised not just spiritual survival, but bodily resurrection, the reconstitution of the physical body at the end of time, when Christ would return and the dead would rise from their graves to be judged. This was a radically new idea, one that challenged both traditional Roman beliefs and most of the mystery cults, and it had profound implications for burial practices. If the body was going to be resurrected, then perhaps it should be preserved intact rather than burned. This is one reason why Christians increasingly preferred inhumation to cremation, laying bodies in sarcophagi or wrapping them in shrouds and placing them in tomb chambers rather than reducing them to ashes. The body was not just a vessel to be discarded, but an essential part of personal identity, something that would be needed again in the world to come. Christianity also transformed the meaning of death itself. Where paganism saw death as a natural ending, perhaps sad but inevitable, Christianity presented death as a defeated enemy, as something Christ had conquered through his own resurrection. To die as a Christian was not to descend into shadowy half-existence, but to fall asleep, to rest temporarily until the Great Awakening, when all believers would rise to eternal life. The very formula that appeared on Christian tombs, in peace, suggested not the anxiety of annihilation, but the calm confidence of those who believed they were only sleeping. Yet despite these theological differences, there were striking continuities between pagan and Christian burial practices. Both traditions built tombs and marked graves. Both performed commemorative rituals at death anniversaries. Both believed that the dead deserved respect and proper burial. Both used burial to express social identity and family relationships. The physical practices, the material culture of death, remained remarkably similar, even as the beliefs about what death meant and what came after were being revolutionized. This is why pagans and Christians could share burial grounds, could use the same tombs, could even adopt each other's symbols and reinterpret them for their own purposes. At the level of actual practice of what people did rather than what they believed, there was enough common ground for coexistence. Both communities were trying to honor their dead, to maintain family bonds across death, to find some way of making mortality bearable. The specific theological frameworks they used to make sense of these needs were different, but the needs themselves were universal. The necropolis on Vatican Hill, then, becomes a window not just into burial practices but into the deepest questions that human beings have always asked. What happens when we die? Does anything of us persist? How should we honor those who have gone before? What obligations do the living owe to the dead? These questions have no final answers, and the tombs offer not solutions but responses. The varied and sometimes contradictory ways that different people in different times have tried to come to terms with mortality. Now we must turn our attention to a story within the story, a tradition that would transform this modest hillside cemetery from a burial ground for ordinary Romans into one of the most sacred sites in Christendom. It is the tradition that somewhere in this necropolis, beneath layers of earth and stone, rests the body of the Apostle Peter, the man whom Christians believe was the first bishop of Rome, the rock upon which Christ built his church, the keeper of the keys to heaven. The story begins, according to Christian tradition, in the year 64 or perhaps 67 of the Common Era, during the reign of the Emperor Nero. Rome had recently suffered a catastrophic fire that destroyed much of the city, and rumours spread that Nero himself had ordered it, that he wanted to clear space for ambitious building projects. To deflect blame and satisfy public anger, Nero accused the Christians, at that time a small and marginal sect, of starting the fire. What followed was persecution, sporadic and localized but brutal nonetheless. Among those arrested and executed, tradition holds, was Peter himself. The details are hazy, preserved only in later Christian writings whose historical reliability is uncertain, but the story goes that Peter was crucified, like his master Christ before him, though Peter requested to be crucified upside down, claiming he was not worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. The execution took place, these accounts say, in or near the Circus of Nero, an arena for chariot races and public spectacles that stood on the slopes of Vatican Hill, not far from the Tiber River. After the execution, Peter's body was taken down from the cross and claimed by his followers, a small community of believers who wanted to give their leader proper burial. But where could they bury him? Christian dead were usually interred in the catacombs, those underground networks of burial chambers that wound beneath the Roman countryside. But the catacombs were some distance from the site of Peter's death, and perhaps his followers wanted him buried nearby, wanted to be able to visit the place where he lay, and so, according to tradition, they brought his body to the necropolis on Vatican Hill, to that same cemetery where ordinary Romans were already being buried, and they laid him to rest there, in a simple grave, unmarked or marked only modestly, indistinguishable from the hundreds of other burials in that place. Peter was buried as he had lived, among common people, in a cemetery for freedmen and merchants and craftsmen, not in any monument befitting an apostle or future saint. For decades, perhaps for more than a century, Peter's grave was tended by a small community of believers who knew where he lay. They visited the site, prayed there, kept alive the memory of his presence. But they did not advertise it, did not build any grand structure over it. Christianity was still illegal, still suspect, and drawing attention to the burial place of a martyred apostle would have been dangerous. By the end of the 2nd century, however, something had changed. A small structure, what scholars call an aedicula or shrine, was built at the site where tradition placed Peter's grave. This was not a tomb in the sense of the other mausolea in the necropolis, but rather a memorial, a marker, a focal point for Christian devotion. It consisted of 2 small columns supporting a horizontal slab, creating a kind of altar or niche. Behind this structure was a wall, plastered and painted red, against which the shrine was set. The existence of this shrine is attested in early Christian writings. A priest named Gaius, writing around the year 200, mentions the Trophy of Peter on Vatican Hill, using the Greek word tropeion, which could mean memorial or shrine. This is the earliest written reference we have to Peter's burial place, and it suggests that by the late 2nd century, the location was known and venerated, that it had become a site of pilgrimage for Roman Christians. But here we must pause and ask difficult questions, questions that historians must always ask when confronted with tradition and faith. Was Peter actually buried here? Did he even die in Rome? The historical evidence is frustratingly thin. No contemporary account describes Peter's martyrdom in Rome. The earliest Christian sources that place him there date from decades after the supposed events. The location of his burial is based entirely on tradition, on the continuous belief of the Roman Christian community that this was where their founding apostle lay. What we can say with more certainty is that by the late 2nd century, Christians believed Peter was buried on Vatican Hill, and they had built a shrine to mark the spot. Whether that belief was based on accurate historical memory or on pious legend, we cannot definitively determine. The tradition may preserve genuine knowledge passed down through generations of believers, or it may be a later construction, a way of claiming sacred authority for the Roman Church by locating its founder's remains within the city. What matters for our story is not whether Peter actually lies beneath Vatican Hill, but that people believed he did, and that belief would have enormous consequences. The shrine became a focal point for Christian devotion in Rome. Pilgrims came to pray there, to seek intercession, to feel themselves in proximity to one of Christ's original disciples. Graffiti scratched into the walls near the shrine bear witness to this devotion, fragments of prayers and invocations, names of visitors, pleas for help or healing. The presence of this shrine transformed the character of the necropolis. What had been simply a cemetery, a place where various people happened to be buried, now had a sacred centre, a point of pilgrimage that drew visitors not because their own families were buried there, but because they sought connection with a holy figure. The ordinary tombs of freedmen and merchants surrounded what Christians believed was the resting place of an apostle, the humble and the sacred occupying the same ground. And yet, crucially, the shrine did not dominate the landscape. It was a small structure, easily overlooked among the many mausolea that crowded Vatican Hill. Christians who came to pray there had to navigate past pagan tombs, past inscriptions invoking the old gods, past all the accumulated material culture of traditional Roman death practices. The sacred and the ordinary remained intermingled. The Christian shrine one element among many in a diverse and complex funerary landscape. This would not always be so. The humble shrine, the modest grave, would eventually be covered by one of the largest churches in Christendom, a basilica that would proclaim to the world the triumph of Christianity and the authority of the Roman Church. But that transformation still lay in the future. For now, in the 3rd century, Peter's supposed grave was just another element in the necropolis, another layer of meaning added to a place already dense with memory and significance. The transformation of the necropolis from cemetery to sacred Christian site began in earnest in the year 312, though its roots reach back to events that unfolded across the Roman Empire in the preceding decades. Christianity, which had spent its first 3 centuries as a persecuted minority religion, was about to become the favoured faith of emperors, and that change would reshape not only the spiritual landscape of Rome, but the physical landscape of Vatican Hill itself. In the year 312, a man named Constantine, one of several rival claimants to the imperial throne, marched on Rome to face his competitor Maxentius in battle. According to Christian sources written later, Constantine experienced a vision before the battle, seeing in the sky a cross of light and the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether this vision actually occurred or was a later invention, Constantine did adopt Christian symbols for his troops, and he did win the battle at the Milvian Bridge, becoming sole ruler of the Western Roman Empire. Constantine's reasons for favouring Christianity were likely complex, mixing genuine religious conviction with political calculation. Christianity was growing rapidly, especially in the eastern provinces, and aligning himself with this rising force may have seemed strategically wise. Whatever his motives, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313, granting Christians freedom to worship openly and restoring property that had been confiscated during earlier persecutions. Christianity was no longer illegal, no longer dangerous. It was becoming, gradually but inexorably, the empire's dominant religion, and Constantine, once established in power, turned his attention to honouring Christian sites and martyrs. In Jerusalem, he ordered the construction of churches over locations associated with Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. In Rome, he did something similar, and the site he chose was Vatican Hill, the place where tradition held that Peter, the first among the apostles, had been martyred and buried. Around the year 326, Constantine ordered the construction of a great basilica directly over the Necropolis, directly over the spot where the small shrine marked Peter's supposed grave. This was an undertaking of enormous ambition and enormous disruption. The hillside would need to be levelled, terraced, transformed from a sloping cemetery into a flat platform capable of supporting a massive church. The existing tombs, some of which had stood for 2 centuries, would need to be dealt with. The solution was both practical and symbolic. Rather than completely demolish the necropolis, rather than excavate all those tombs and remove all those remains, Constantine's builders chose to preserve the tombs while burying them. They removed the roofs of the mausolea, breaking through vaults and ceilings. They filled the interior chambers with earth and rubble, burying the sarcophagi and urns where they lay, sealing the dead in their resting places. They left the walls standing but covered them, creating a vast platform of earth and stone held in place by the existing tomb structures, now repurposed as a kind of foundation. Imagine the scene as this work progressed. Workers with shovels and carts, moving earth, breaking stone, the dust rising in clouds that must have been visible across the Tiber in Rome proper. The tombs that families had maintained for generations, where they had come to pour libations and speak prayers, were disappearing beneath loads of fill dirt. The funerary road where mourners had walked was obliterated, covered over, becoming part of the foundation for something entirely new. Some tombs were demolished entirely, their materials perhaps recycled for use in the new construction. But many, especially those in the central area near Peter's shrine, were preserved in this strange half-destruction, buried alive, so to speak, their interiors still intact but sealed off from the world above, entombed within the new construction like fossils within sedimentary rock. The dead remained where they had been laid, undisturbed in their sarcophagi and urns, but the world moved on without them, building new structures, new meanings, new sacred geographies on top of their forgotten graves. The basilica that rose on this platform was enormous by the standards of its time. It was oriented east to west, as Christian churches traditionally were, with its entrance facing east toward Rome and its apse at the western end, directly over the spot where Peter's shrine had stood. The shrine itself was not destroyed, but enclosed, incorporated into the structure of the new church, becoming the focal point around which everything else was organized. A massive bronze canopy, supported by twisted columns, marked the spot, announcing to all who entered that here, beneath their feet, lay the bones of the apostle. The basilica Constantine built was not the ornate Renaissance structure that stands today. It was simpler, more austere. Large rectangular hall with a timber roof, columns dividing the interior into a central nave and side aisles, windows high in the walls letting in shafts of light. But it was still immense, capable of holding thousands of worshippers, a statement of imperial power and Christian triumph rendered in brick and marble and wood. For the necropolis, this transformation marked the end of one existence and the beginning of another. No longer a living cemetery, a place where people came to bury their dead and tend their graves, it became instead a hidden foundation, a buried memory, a layer of history sealed beneath the floor of Christendom's most important church. The pagan tombs, the mixed pagan and Christian tombs, the ordinary lives of freedmen and merchants and craftsmen, all disappeared from view, replaced by a new narrative focused entirely on Peter and the Christian church he supposedly founded. Yet in being buried, the necropolis was also preserved. Had Constantine's builders chosen to excavate completely, to remove all the tombs and remains, nothing would have survived. The necropolis would be known to us only through fragmentary literary references, if at all. But by filling the tombs rather than demolishing them, by sealing them beneath earth and the basilica floor, the builders created a time capsule, a preserved moment of late antique life that would wait in darkness for more than 1,500 years before being rediscovered. There is something profoundly symbolic in this burial of the necropolis beneath the basilica. It suggests how Christianity built itself on foundations of earlier beliefs and practices, how it incorporated and transformed what came before rather than simply replacing it. The pagan tombs remained, supporting the Christian church literally and perhaps metaphorically. The old world was not erased but covered over, its structures repurposed for new meanings, its dead conscripted into new narratives about sanctity and martyrdom and the triumph of the true faith. And it raises questions about memory and forgetting, about what is preserved and what is lost when one age gives way to another. The families whose tombs were buried, did they protest? Did they mourn the loss of access to their ancestral graves? Or had they themselves converted to Christianity by then? And did they see the basilica's construction as a worthy sacrifice? Their pagan ancestors now resting in the shadow of Peter's shrine, incorporated into a new and grander story of salvation. Once the basilica was complete, once the great church stood gleaming on Vatican Hill with its timber roof and marble columns, and bronze canopy over Peter's shrine, the necropolis entered a new phase of existence, or rather, ceased to exist as anything but foundation and forgotten memory. The tombs lay silent in darkness, sealed beneath tons of earth and the massive floor of the basilica. No mourners came to pour libations, no family members gathered for anniversary, commemorations, no pilgrims paused to read inscriptions or admire mosaic floors. The funerary road that had once threaded between mausolea was gone, obliterated, its very location lost to memory. Above, in the world of light and sound and human activity, the basilica became one of the great pilgrimage destinations of Christendom. Believers came from across the empire and later from across medieval Europe to pray at Peter's tomb, to seek intercession from the martyred apostle, to feel themselves in proximity to the origins of their faith. They walked on floors that rested on buried pagan tombs, knelt on stones that covered the remains of freedmen and merchants who had never heard of Christ. The layers of time were compressed, the Christian present built literally on top of the pagan past, with all the complexity and contradiction that entailed. The basilica Constantine built stood for more than 1,000 years, evolving and accumulating additions as centuries passed. Chapels were added, decorations updated, repairs made after earthquakes or fires or simple decay. Popes were crowned within its walls. Great councils met there to debate doctrine and settle disputes. It became not just a church, but the church, the symbolic centre of Western Christianity, the seat of papal power, the place where heaven and earth were understood to intersect most directly. But even great buildings age and eventually require replacement. By the late 15th century, Constantine's basilica was showing its age badly. The timber roof beams were rotting, walls were cracking, the structure was subsiding unevenly, creating dangerous instabilities. Pope Nicholas V and later Pope Julius II decided that rather than repair the old basilica, they would replace it entirely with something grander, something that would properly express the power and glory of the Renaissance papacy. And so, beginning in 1506, the old basilica began to come down, demolished piece by piece to make way for the new. This was not a quick process, but a vast construction project that would consume more than a century, involving some of the greatest architects and artists of the age. Bramante, Michelangelo, Bernini and others would contribute to what would become the basilica we see today, with its enormous dome visible from across Rome, its sweeping colonnades embracing pilgrims, its interior decorated with marble and gold and masterworks of Renaissance and Baroque art. Beneath this new construction, the buried necropolis continued its silent existence, undisturbed and largely forgotten. The new basilica, like the old, was built over and around the traditional site of Peter's tomb, which remained the focal point, the axis around which everything else was organised. But the ancient cemetery that surrounded that tomb, the ordinary Romans who had been buried there before Peter became a pilgrimage site, they sank deeper into obscurity with each passing century, medieval and Renaissance. Christians knew, in a vague way, that there were ancient structures beneath the basilica. Literary sources mentioned Constantine's construction and the hillside cemetery that had existed before. But this knowledge was abstract, theoretical. No one had seen the buried tombs. No one knew what remained down there in the darkness. The necropolis became a kind of rumour, a half-remembered fragment of history that had no bearing on present concerns, and so the centuries accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer. The Renaissance gave way to the Baroque to the Enlightenment to modernity. Above ground, history continued its restless course. Empires rose and fell, religions split and reformed, science transformed humanity's understanding of the world, wars ravaged Europe, ideologies competed for allegiance, the pace of change accelerated, each generation experiencing more transformation than the last. But below, in the buried necropolis, time had stopped. The tombs remained as they had been left in the 4th century, sealed in darkness, their mosaics and frescoes fading in the airless gloom, their inscriptions waiting to be read, their sarcophagi holding bones that had not seen light for more than 1,500 years. It was a preserved moment, a snapshot of late antique life frozen beneath the living, changing world above. The silence down there must have been absolute. No sound from the basilica above penetrated through meters of earth and stone. No footsteps echoed in those sealed chambers. No wind stirred the dust. The tombs existed in a state of perfect stillness, a darkness so complete it was almost a presence in itself, pressing in from all sides, filling every space, obliterating every distinction between wall and floor and ceiling. Yet the tombs were not empty, not meaningless voids. They remained what they had always been, repositories of human remains, of human memory, of human attempts to impose order and meaning on the chaos of mortality. The bones and ashes they held were still there, still material evidence of lives once lived. The inscriptions were still legible, at least in theory, still carrying their messages across time. The decorations, though fading, still expressed the aesthetic choices and religious beliefs of people dead for millennia. In this sense, the necropolis in its buried state was not destroyed but preserved, held in suspension, waiting. Archaeological sites that remain visible and accessible are constantly subject to decay, to weathering, to the destructive attention of treasure hunters and vandals. But the buried necropolis was protected by its very obscurity, by the weight of earth and stone that sealed it away from the world. Time passed above, but the tombs endured below, patient and silent, containing within their brick walls a record of ordinary Roman lives that would otherwise have left no trace in history. This is one of the strange paradoxes of the necropolis story. The very act that seemed to destroy it, the burial beneath Constantine's basilica, actually ensured its survival. Had the cemetery remained open and accessible, had families continued to visit their ancestral tombs, through the long centuries of Christianity's dominance, those tombs would likely have been gradually dismantled, their materials recycled, their decorations defaced or removed. But sealed away, forgotten, the necropolis became a time capsule, preserving a moment of religious transition that would have been lost. And so the dead waited in darkness, their names unspoken, their lives unremembered, surrounded by the evidence of who they had been and what they had believed, while above them the great basilica proclaimed a triumph they could not have imagined and would not have understood. The rediscovery of the necropolis began not with grand plans or archaeological ambition, but with death and the peculiar requirements of papal burial. In February of 1939, Pope Pius IV died, and according to tradition, he was to be interred in the grottos beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in that sacred space where popes had been buried for centuries. To prepare a suitable tomb, workers needed to lower the floor level slightly in one section of the grottos to create more headroom and make the space more dignified for its new occupant. As they dug down, carefully removing earth and rubble, the workers encountered something unexpected. Their shovels struck not bedrock, or more filled dirt, but the top of a brick wall. Further excavation revealed that this was not a random fragment, but part of a structure, a built thing with right angles and deliberate construction. Word reached Pope Pius X, who had just assumed the papacy, and he made a decision that would prove momentous. Rather than simply work around this obstruction, rather than remove it and continue with the burial preparations, he ordered a full archaeological investigation. The wall, whatever it was, would be explored, documented, understood. What followed was a decade-long excavation, carried out in difficult conditions under the basilica floor. The space was cramped, the air stale, the lighting poor. Workers and archaeologists had to proceed carefully, never knowing what the next removal of earth might reveal, or what structural risks they might encounter. The basilica above needed to remain stable, its foundations undisturbed, even as the excavation opened up voids and chambers that had been sealed for 16 centuries. Slowly, painstakingly, the necropolis emerged from its burial. First one tomb, then another, then entire rows of mausolea came to light. The funerary road was traced, its ancient surface uncovered, the path that mourners had once walked now open again to human footsteps. Walls were cleaned, revealing faded frescoes and stucco decorations. Floors were brushed free of centuries of dust, exposing mosaics whose colours, though muted, still showed the patterns their makers had intended. Inscriptions were photographed, transcribed, studied, their Latin text speaking across vast gulfs of time. The archaeological team discovered that the necropolis was remarkably well preserved. The filling in of the tombs during Constantine's construction had actually protected them from collapse, and from the kind of slow degradation that affects structures exposed to air and moisture. The roofs were gone, removed in antiquity, but the walls stood firm. The decorations had faded but not disappeared. The human remains were largely undisturbed, still resting where they had been placed in the 1st through 4th centuries. The excavation revealed the full extent of the cemetery, or at least the portion of it directly beneath the basilica. They found approximately 22 separate tomb buildings arranged along a roughly 100-metre stretch of the ancient funerary road. Each tomb was documented in detail, its dimensions, its construction methods, its decorative program, its inscriptions, its contents. Archaeologists counted niches and arcosolia, inventoried urns and sarcophagi, photographed every mosaic and fresco, recorded every name and epitaph they could decipher. The tombs varied considerably in size and elaboration, as we have already seen, reflecting the different means and ambitions of the families who built them. Some were simple rectangular chambers with plain walls and a few niches for urns. Others were more complex, with multiple rooms, vaulted ceilings, elaborate decorations, space for dozens of burials across multiple generations. The variation spoke to the social diversity of those buried here, to the range of people who had found their final rest on Vatican Hill. The excavation also confirmed the presence of Christian burials and Christian symbols alongside pagan ones, documenting that crucial moment of religious transition that we have explored. The tomb of the Julii, with its solar chariot and vine-covered vault, was one of the most significant discoveries, a perfect example of how pagan and Christian iconography could coexist in a single decorative program. Other tombs showed similar mixing, or showed purely Christian or purely pagan decoration, collectively painting a picture of a cemetery where multiple belief systems had shared space for centuries. As the excavation progressed, attention naturally focused on the area beneath the high altar of the basilica, the spot where tradition placed Peter's tomb. Here, the archaeologists found what they were looking for, or something like it. They uncovered the red wall, the plastered surface against which the early Christian shrine had been built. They found the remains of the edicula, the small memorial structure with its columns and niches. They found graffiti scratched into the plaster, fragmentary inscriptions that scholars interpreted as prayers or invocations, though the readings were and remain controversial, and they found bones. In a niche within the structure, sealed and hidden, were human remains. Analysis suggested they belonged to a man of about 60 or 70 years of age who had lived in the 1st century. Could these be Peter's bones? The church authorities thought so, or at least wanted to think so. In 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that the bones had been identified as those of Peter, though many scholars remained and remain skeptical of this claim. The discovery of the necropolis created considerable excitement, both within the Catholic Church and among historians and archaeologists more broadly. Here was a direct physical connection to early Christianity, to the world of the apostles and martyrs, to the moment when Christianity transformed from persecuted sect to imperial religion. Here was material evidence for traditions that had previously existed only in literary sources. And here, perhaps most importantly, was a window into ordinary Roman life, into the beliefs and practices of people whose voices are rarely preserved in historical records. The Vatican opened portions of the necropolis to visitors, though access remained and remains carefully controlled. Only small groups can descend into the excavated area at any time, and only with official guides. The space is fragile, the air quality poor, the lighting minimal. But for those who make the descent, who walk along that ancient funerary road past tomb after tomb, the experience is profound. To stand in a space that has not changed in 1600 years, to see decorations created by human hands 2 millennia ago, to read names and ages carved in stone, is to feel the presence of the past in a visceral, immediate way. The excavation also raised new questions, as good archaeological work always does. How far did the necropolis originally extend? Were there other significant Christian sites nearby? What happened to the tombs that lay outside the excavated area, those that were demolished rather than buried? And the eternal question, are those really Peter's bones? Or do they belong to some other unknown man whose remains happened to be in the right place when later Christians came looking for their martyred apostle? Among all the discoveries made during the excavation of the necropolis, few have generated as much debate and controversy as the evidence surrounding Peter's supposed tomb. The tradition that Peter was buried on Vatican Hill is ancient, dating back at least to the late 2nd century, but tradition is not the same as historical proof. The archaeologists working beneath the basilica knew they were treading on ground where faith and scholarship intersected, where any discovery would be scrutinized both for its scientific validity and its theological implications. What they found was suggestive but not conclusive, fascinating but ambiguous, the kind of evidence that allows multiple interpretations depending on one's predispositions and desires. Near the center of the excavated area, directly beneath the high altar of the basilica, they uncovered the red wall, a structure plastered and painted in red ochre that dated to the mid-2nd century. Against this wall had been built the edicula mentioned in early Christian writings, that small shrine consisting of 2 columns supporting a horizontal slab, creating a niche or memorial space. The positioning was significant. Constantine's basilica had been deliberately oriented to place its high altar and apse directly over this spot, and the later Renaissance basilica had maintained the same orientation. For 16 centuries this had been understood as the location of Peter's tomb, the axis around which the entire church was organized. Now the excavation was revealing the physical remains of that early shrine, confirming that Christians in the 2nd century had indeed venerated something at this location. But what were they venerating? The shrine itself contained no body, no sarcophagus, no obvious burial. Instead, there was a complex of niches and cavities within the red wall and the structures around it, spaces that might have originally held something but were now largely empty. The archaeologists did find bones, fragmented and mixed with earth, in various locations around the shrine. Some were clearly not human, others were human but seemed to represent multiple individuals of different ages and sexes. One particular deposit of bones drew special attention. These had been found wrapped in cloth and enclosed in a niche that had been sealed, apparently in antiquity. Analysis determined that the bones belonged to a single individual, a man of approximately 60 to 70 years of age. The bones showed signs of earth staining, suggesting they had been buried in the ground before being moved to this secondary location. There were no bones from the feet, which might be consistent with tradition that Peter was crucified, his feet nailed to the cross. The Vatican's official archaeologist, Marguerite Guarducci, argued that these were indeed Peter's bones, that they had been moved from an original burial site nearby into this protective niche during the construction of Constantine's basilica, when the area was being filled in and there was concern that the tomb might be damaged or lost. She pointed to graffiti scratched into the plaster near the niche, fragmentary Greek letters that she interpreted as reading "Peter is here" or "Peter in peace," though these readings were and remain highly controversial, with other scholars seeing different letters or finding the inscriptions too damaged to read with certainty. Other experts were more skeptical. The bones could belong to anyone, they pointed out. The absence of foot bones is interesting, but hardly proof of crucifixion. People die and are buried without feet for many reasons. The graffiti, if it even mentions Peter, might simply reflect later belief rather than historical fact. And most fundamentally, even if one accepts that 2nd century Christians believed Peter was buried at this spot, that belief might be mistaken, based on faulty tradition or pious wish, rather than actual knowledge of where the apostle's body lay. The debate continues. In 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that the bones had been identified as those of Peter, giving the Church's official imprimatur to Guarducci's interpretation. But many archaeologists and historians, both Catholic and non-Catholic, remain unconvinced. They accept that the excavation revealed important evidence about early Christian veneration on Vatican Hill, but they argue that we cannot know with certainty whether Peter was actually buried there, and if he was, whether any of the bones found belonged to him. This uncertainty might seem frustrating, especially given the importance of the question. But in another sense, the ambiguity is instructive. It reminds us of the limitations of archaeological evidence, of how much of the past remains unknowable despite our best efforts to recover it. We have the red wall, the shrine, the graffiti, the bones. But we cannot interrogate the people who built these structures, cannot ask them what they knew and how they knew it. We are left with fragmentary evidence that must be interpreted, and interpretation always involves assumptions, beliefs, and desires. What we can say with confidence is that by the late 2nd century the Christian community in Rome believed that Peter had been buried on Vatican Hill and had built a shrine to mark the spot. Whether that belief was based on reliable historical memory or on later tradition, we cannot determine. We know that this shrine became a focal point for Christian devotion, that it attracted pilgrims and prayers, that it was important enough to Constantine that he built his great basilica directly over it, accepting the enormous expense and difficulty of levelling a hillside and burying an entire cemetery to do so. We know that the presence of this shrine, and the tradition it represented, transformed the Vatican from a marginal area outside Rome's walls into one of the most important religious sites in the world. We know that the belief in Peter's burial here helped establish Rome's claim to primacy among Christian churches, since Peter was understood as the first bishop of Rome, the rock on which Christ built his church. Whether Peter actually lies beneath the basilica becomes, in this larger context, almost secondary to the power of the belief itself, to what that belief made possible and how it shaped history. The bones found in the excavation, whether they belong to Peter or to some unknown Roman who died in the 1st century, have become relics in the truest sense, objects that carry meaning not primarily through what they are materially, but through what they represent symbolically. They are focal points for faith, for tradition, for the human need to feel connected across time to foundational moments and figures. They are also, in their ambiguity, reminders of how much of what we believe about the past rests on interpretation rather than certainty, on tradition rather than proof. The Necropolis excavation revealed many things, but perhaps its most important revelation is this: that history and faith intersect in complex ways, that the line between what we know and what we believe is often blurred, and that the meaning we assign to the past is shaped as much by our present needs and desires as by the fragmentary evidence that survives from ancient times. Let us imagine descending now into the excavated necropolis as it exists today, walking down the stairs from the basilica floor into the world that was hidden for 16 centuries. The transition is abrupt, almost shocking. One moment you are in the bright ornate interior of St. Peter's, surrounded by marble and gold, by soaring architecture and Renaissance masterpieces. The next, you're in a narrow corridor of ancient brick, dimly lit, the air noticeably cooler and heavier, carrying the distinctive smell of earth and old stone. The funerary road stretches before you, no longer open to sky but roofed over by the massive structure above. Electric lights have been installed, discreet but necessary, casting a warm glow that approximates candlelight. The modern lighting is carefully positioned to highlight the tombs without overwhelming them, to allow visitors to see the details of mosaics and frescoes without destroying the atmosphere of antiquity that pervades this space. You walk slowly along the ancient path, your footsteps echoing slightly despite your efforts at quiet. On either side, tomb facades rise from the excavated floor. The brick is weathered, pockmarked in places, but structurally sound. Some facades retain traces of plaster, ghostly remnants of the smooth surfaces that once covered this utilitarian material. Here and there you can still see where pigment clung to that plaster, suggestions of the colours that once made this a less sombre place, that spoke of life and memory rather than decay and forgetting. The first tomb you pass shows its interior through a doorway that was never meant to be seen from outside. The roofs, remember, were removed in antiquity, and the chambers were filled with earth. When archaeologists excavated, they removed that fill, restoring the tombs to something like their original state, though now they are open to view from above as well as through their doorways. You step to the threshold and look inside. The chamber is perhaps 4 meters square, with walls rising to where a vault once curved overhead. The floor is mosaic, a simple geometric pattern in earth tones. Along the walls, niches for urns are visible, dark rectangular openings that recede into the masonry. Move on to the next tomb, and then the next. Each is slightly different, reflecting the tastes and means of different families. This one has more elaborate decoration, stucco work still visible on the walls, raised patterns that catch the light and create subtle shadows. That one has painted scenes, so faded they are barely visible, hints of garlands and birds that require imagination to fully perceive. Another shows clear Christian symbols, a fish carved into the plaster near a burial niche, an anchor symbol suggesting hope in the resurrection. The cumulative effect of moving through this space is profound. You're not visiting a reconstruction or a museum display. You're walking through actual structures built 2,000 years ago, standing where Roman mourners stood, seeing decorations created by craftsmen whose dust now mingles with the earth that fills forgotten corners. The connection to the past is direct, unmediated by later interpretation or reconstruction. These walls, these floors, these niches are the real things, preserved by accident and rediscovered by chance. As you continue along the funerary road, you come eventually to the area beneath the high altar, the heart of the necropolis in both physical and symbolic terms. Here the excavation has revealed the red wall, now protected behind glass, its surface bearing those controversial scratches and marks that might or might not mention Peter. The wall is remarkably well preserved, its red plaster still adhering to the brick substrate, its colour still visible though muted by time. The edicular is here too, or what remains of it. The 2 columns that once supported the memorial structure have been reconstructed, standing now as they stood in the 2nd century, marking this spot as special, as sacred, as worthy of veneration. Between them, the niche that might have held Peter's bones, or might have held something else entirely, opens like a small dark mouth in the wall. You cannot touch it, cannot approach too closely because of barriers installed to protect the fragile structures, but you can see it, can contemplate what it might mean. Standing here, in this specific location, you're at the intersection of multiple layers of meaning. Beneath your feet might lie the bones of a martyred apostle, or might lie the bones of an unknown Roman, or might lie nothing at all, the original burial lost to time and disturbance. Above you rises one of the largest churches in the world, built here specifically because of belief in what lies below. Around you are the tombs of ordinary people, freedmen and merchants who had no idea their final resting place would become the foundation for such grandeur, whose modest memorials would be buried beneath imperial Christianity's architectural triumph. The necropolis as it exists today is both a historical site and an active pilgrimage destination. Small groups of visitors descend daily, guided by Vatican officials who explain what they're seeing, who place the tombs in historical context, who tell the story of excavation and discovery. For believers, the experience is often deeply moving, a chance to feel proximity to the origins of their faith, to stand where Peter might have been buried, to connect across 2 millennia with the earliest Christians. For historians and archaeology enthusiasts, it is a rare opportunity to see a preserved moment of religious transition, to witness how pagan and Christian cultures interacted and influenced each other. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of the necropolis is what it reveals about ordinary lives, about the universal human experiences that transcend religious belief and historical period. These tombs speak of love and loss, of family bonds and the need to be remembered. They speak of people who worked and saved to afford a decent burial, who wanted their names preserved, who grieved for children taken too soon, and honoured parents who lived long lives. They speak ultimately of the same emotions and needs that motivate us today when we bury our own dead and mark their graves. Walking back along the funerary road toward the stairs that will return you to the basilica above, you might reflect on the strange journey these tombs have taken. Built to be seen, they were buried and forgotten. Intended as permanent memorials, they became hidden foundations. Meant to preserve individual memory, they became anonymous ruins. And then, through chance and papal death and archaeological curiosity, they were rediscovered, brought back into human awareness, given new life as witnesses to a vanished world. The dead in being found were remembered again. Their names, unspoken for 16 centuries, were read aloud once more, and in that reading, in that remembering, they achieved something of what they had hoped for when their tombs were first built: continuation beyond death, presence in the world of the living, however transformed and unexpected that presence might be. The story of the Vatican Necropolis is ultimately a story about transformation, about how one kind of sacred space became another, how pagan burial grounds were repurposed as Christian foundations, how ordinary tombs became the substrate for extraordinary claims of sanctity and apostolic authority. To understand what this transformation meant, we must step back and consider the broader context of religious change in the late Roman world, the shift from paganism to Christianity that reshaped not just beliefs, but entire landscapes of meaning. When Constantine ordered his basilica built over the necropolis in the 4th century, he was making a statement about power and legitimacy. Christianity had won. The old gods were defeated, their temples being abandoned or converted, their rituals becoming memories. The future belonged to Christ and his church, and that future would be built quite literally on top of the pagan past. The necropolis, with its mixture of pagan and Christian burials, with its evidence of religious coexistence and transition, was covered over, hidden, made into foundation, rather than allowed to remain as testimony to complexity and ambiguity. This was not unique to Vatican Hill. Across the empire, Christian churches were being built on sites that had been sacred to older religions. Temples were demolished or converted. Sacred groves were cut down. Springs and wells that had been dedicated to pagan deities were rededicated to Christian saints. The landscape itself was being Christianized, the old religious geography erased or overwritten with new meanings, new associations, new claims about which places were holy and why. But the process was never complete, never total. Beneath the Christian present, the pagan past persisted, sometimes literally as with the Vatican necropolis, sometimes in subtler ways, in folk practices that continued despite official disapproval, in beliefs that were nominally Christian but retained elements of older worldviews, in places that were sacred before Christianity and remained sacred after, their sanctity transferring rather than disappearing. The necropolis beneath St. Peter's embodies this incomplete transformation. The pagan tombs were buried but not destroyed, covered but not removed, made invisible but not annihilated. They continued to exist, supporting the basilica above, their brick walls bearing the literal weight of Christian architecture. This seems almost too perfect as metaphor, too neat as symbol, but it is also simply material fact. The church was built on pagan foundations because those foundations were already there, because it was easier to bury the tombs than to remove them, because the structural engineering of the time made it sensible to use existing walls as support for the new platform. Yet the metaphoric resonance is real nonetheless. Christianity in Rome and throughout the empire was built on pagan foundations, not just architecturally but culturally, socially, intellectually. The church absorbed and adapted elements of Roman culture, legal concepts, administrative structures, philosophical ideas. It took over pagan festivals and gave them Christian meanings. It adopted pagan symbols and reinterpreted them through Christian theology. It used the infrastructure of the Roman state, including eventually the state itself, to spread its message and enforce its doctrines. The transformation of the necropolis from cemetery to church foundation also reflects larger patterns about memory and forgetting, about what gets preserved and what gets lost when one age gives way to another. The individual dead of the necropolis, those freedmen and merchants and families whose names were carved in stone, were forgotten. Their tombs became anonymous ruins, their inscriptions unread, their stories lost. But Peter, or the tradition of Peter, was remembered and magnified, becoming the focal point around which an entire religious and political structure was built. This is how history often works. The lives of ordinary people fade from memory unless some accident preserves them, some quirk of chance that allows their voices to echo forward through time. Meanwhile, the famous, the powerful, the symbolically important figures become ever larger, their actual lives obscured by layers of legend and interpretation, their human reality replaced by mythic significance. Peter the man, if he existed, and if he was buried on Vatican Hill, was just one among 1,000 people interred in that cemetery. But Peter the symbol, Peter the rock on which Christ built his church, Peter the keeper of heaven's keys, became more real, more present, more powerful than any actual human being could ever be. The necropolis also teaches us about resilience and impermanence. The tombs were built to last forever, to preserve memory across generations, and in a sense they succeeded, surviving 2,000 years, outlasting the empire that built them, persisting through barbarian invasions and medieval upheavals and Renaissance transformations. But they survived by being buried, by becoming invisible, by ceasing to function as tombs and becoming instead accidental preservation chambers. Their permanence was achieved through their disappearance. This paradox runs through all of human history. What we build to last often crumbles quickly. What survives often does so by accident, preserved by burial or isolation or simple neglect. The great monuments we create to proclaim our importance to future ages are dismantled for building materials or eroded by weather and time. But humble objects, ordinary things buried in trash pits or lost in wells, persist and eventually tell future archaeologists more about how we actually lived than any grand monument ever could. The necropolis in its buried state was both dead and alive, both forgotten and preserved, both erased and maintained. It existed in a kind of suspended animation, a space outside of time, unchanging while the world above transformed repeatedly. When it was finally rediscovered, when archaeologists descended into those dim chambers and saw what had been hidden for 16 centuries, they were not discovering something new, but recovering something old, not inventing a past, but revealing it. And what they revealed was messy, complicated, resistant to simple narratives. Not a purely Christian site, but a mixed one. Not a grand monument, but ordinary tombs. Not clear evidence of Peter's burial, but ambiguous remains open to interpretation. The necropolis, in its very ambiguity and complexity, in its mixture of pagan and Christian, in its combination of the humble and the supposedly sacred, tells a truer story about religious change than any triumphalist account of Christianity's victory over paganism ever could. It shows us that religious transitions are not clean breaks, but long processes, that beliefs change gradually through personal and family conversions rather than through dramatic mass transformations, that sacred spaces accumulate meanings rather than replacing them, that history is layered and that each layer influences those above and below it. The necropolis is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over and over each text, partially obscuring but never completely erasing what came before. And so the pagan tombs support the Christian basilica, the ordinary dead surround the supposedly apostolic burial, the forgotten lives of freedmen frame the remembered tradition of a saint. All of this exists together, layered in stone and earth and meaning, waiting beneath the basilica floor for those willing to descend into darkness to see what light reveals. Think now about the people who rest in those tombs, about the 1,000 or more individuals whose bones and ashes lie beneath the basilica floor. Who were they really, beyond the brief inscriptions that mark their passing? What did they hope for, fear, love, dream? We can never know most of this, of course. The inner lives of ordinary Romans 2,000 years ago are largely inaccessible to us, lost beyond any possibility of recovery. But the necropolis itself, the physical evidence it contains, allows us to reconstruct at least the outlines of their lives, to understand something of their world and their place in it. Many were freed people, as we have seen, former slaves who had earned or purchased their liberty. This tells us something important about social mobility in imperial Rome. Slavery was brutal and dehumanizing, but it was not necessarily permanent. Skilled slaves, educated slaves, slaves who managed their masters' businesses or households, could sometimes accumulate enough money to buy their freedom. Or they might be freed in their master's wills, a final gift or perhaps recognition of loyal service. Once free, they became Roman citizens, though of a lesser status than those born free, and they could work, save, marry, and establish families. The freed people buried in the necropolis had achieved something remarkable by the standards of their time. They had risen from slavery to citizenship. They had accumulated enough wealth to purchase tomb plots and build mausolea. They had established themselves as respectable members of society, with family bonds and social connections and resources to ensure their memory would be preserved. These were success stories, in a sense, people who had navigated the harsh realities of Roman social hierarchies and emerged with dignity and modest prosperity. But think too about what is not recorded in the inscriptions. The years of slavery, perhaps the indignities and hardships endured before freedom was achieved. The children who might have been born in slavery and thus belong not to their parents, but to their parents' owners. The constant awareness of being lesser, of being marked by servile origin even after gaining legal freedom. The Roman social system was rigid and hierarchical, and the stigma of slavery never entirely disappeared, even for those who had transcended it. Consider too the children buried in the necropolis, those whose inscriptions record ages of 2 or 5 or 9. Each one represents a family's grief, parents outliving offspring in violation of what should be the natural order. Infant and child mortality was horrifyingly high in the ancient world, with perhaps half of all children dying before reaching adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, the general precariousness of pre-modern life all took their toll on the young and vulnerable. Yet each child who died was mourned. Each was given a burial, often with as much care and expense as the family could afford. Each was memorialized with an inscription that preserved their name and age. In death, at least, children were honored as individuals, as people who mattered, whose brief lives deserved recognition. The grief embedded in those inscriptions is still palpable across the gulf of 2 millennia. Sweet child, taken too soon. Our beloved daughter, torn from us in her innocence. The words are formulaic, conventional, but the emotions they express are universal and timeless. Think about the women of the necropolis, whose identities in the inscriptions are almost always defined through relationships to men. Wife of, daughter of, mother of. This reflects the legal and social reality of Roman life, where women were always under the guardianship of fathers, husbands, or male relatives, where their public identities were subsumed into family structures. Yet we know that women's actual lives were often more complex than these inscriptions suggest. Women managed households, which in wealthy families could mean supervising dozens of slaves and freed people, managing complex budgets, making daily decisions that affected many lives. Women worked, especially in lower economic classes, as midwives and wet nurses and shopkeepers and weavers. Women participated in religious life, serving as priestesses in various cults, organizing festivals, maintaining household shrines. Women influenced their husbands and sons, shaping family decisions even if they could not exercise formal legal power. The inscriptions reduce all this complexity to relationship status, but the reality was richer and more varied. Think about the merchants and craftsmen, the grain dealers and cloth sellers, the potters and metalworkers whose professions are occasionally noted in epitaphs. These were the people who made the Roman economy function, who moved goods through markets, who transformed raw materials into finished products, who provided the daily necessities that allowed urban life to continue. They were not famous. They did not appear in historical chronicles or political debates. But without them, Rome could not have existed as it did. Think too about the mixture of origins represented in the necropolis. Some names are Latin, thoroughly Roman. Others are Greek, reflecting the enormous Greek-speaking population in Rome, people from the eastern Mediterranean who had migrated or been brought as slaves to the capital. Still other names suggest origins in Egypt or Syria or Gaul, pointing to the cosmopolitan nature of imperial Rome, the way it drew people from across the known world into its orbit. Each person buried in the necropolis was unique, a complete individual with a full life story that unfolded over decades. They had childhoods and youths and adult years. They had relationships with family and friends. They had work they did, perhaps work they took pride in, or perhaps work they endured. They had pleasures and sorrows, moments of joy and periods of grief, experiences that shaped who they were and how they understood their place in the world. And yet almost everything about them is lost. We have their names sometimes. We have their ages at death. Occasionally we know their profession or their relationship to someone else, but their personalities, their thoughts, their daily experiences, their hopes and fears and dreams, all of this has vanished completely, leaving only these bare, factual remnants carved in stone. This is the human condition, perhaps, or at least the common human fate. Most people who have ever lived are completely forgotten. Their lives, no matter how rich or meaningful to themselves and those who knew them, leave no permanent trace. They exist for a few decades, experience the world, and then disappear, their memory fading first from living minds and then from any record at all. Even those who achieve some small measure of remembrance, as the people in the necropolis did through their tombs and inscriptions, are eventually reduced to bare facts, stripped of everything that made them fully human. Yet there is something in us that rebels against this forgetting, that insists on memory, that builds tombs and carves names and creates monuments. The necropolis is a testament to this impulse, this refusal to accept that death means total obliteration. Even though we know that memory fades, that stone erodes, that eventually all our efforts at preservation will fail, we still try. We still mark graves and record names and build structures meant to last forever, knowing they will not last forever, but hoping they might last long enough to give our lives some small purchase on eternity. The necropolis beneath St. Peter's exists now in a strange state, neither fully past nor quite present, suspended between history and living memory. It is an archaeological site, preserved and studied, its structures documented and its inscriptions catalogued. But it is also an active religious site, still fulfilling in some way its original purpose, as a place of pilgrimage and veneration, though the focus has narrowed from many to one, from a community of the dead to the supposed tomb of a single apostle. This dual nature creates tensions and raises questions about how we should understand and relate to such places. Should the necropolis be primarily a historical resource, a source of information about ancient Roman life and early Christianity? Or should it be primarily a sacred space, a site of religious devotion where faith takes precedence over scholarship? The answer, inevitably, is that it must be both, that these purposes can coexist even if they sometimes pull in different directions. For historians and archaeologists, the necropolis is invaluable precisely because it was sealed away for so long, because it escaped the modifications and reinterpretations that affect sites that remain in continuous use. The tombs are a snapshot of late antiquity, a preserved moment that allows us to study burial practices, religious transitions, social structures, artistic styles, and daily life in ways that would be impossible with sites that were constantly altered over centuries. Every mosaic tile, every painted wall, every inscription is data, evidence, a piece of a puzzle we are trying to reconstruct. But for believers, particularly Catholic believers, the necropolis is something else entirely. It is holy ground, the place where the first pope was martyred and buried, the foundation upon which the church was built. The historical questions, while interesting, are secondary to the spiritual significance of the site. To stand where Peter stood, to pray where his bones might lie, to connect across 2,000 years with the origins of Christian faith, this is what matters most. The ordinary Romans buried alongside Peter are at best context, at worst distractions from the site's true meaning. These different ways of understanding the necropolis are not easily reconciled. Scholarly inquiry tends to complicate and question, to find ambiguity where tradition prefers certainty, to emphasize the ordinary and human aspects of history rather than the exceptional and sacred. Faith, conversely, seeks meaning and connection, values tradition and continuity, finds in uncertain evidence confirmation of what is already believed. Both approaches have validity, both offer insights, but they operate according to different logics and often reach different conclusions. The necropolis, in its layered complexity, can accommodate both perspectives. It is simultaneously a cemetery of ordinary Romans and the supposed burial place of an apostle. It is both pagan and Christian, both humble and sacred, both historical and mythic. This multiplicity of meanings, rather than being a problem to be resolved, might be understood as the site's richest quality, its ability to speak to different people in different ways, to hold multiple truths in tension, without requiring them to cancel each other out. Consider what has been lost and what has been preserved in the necropolis's long history. The original purposes of the pagan tombs, the rituals and beliefs that gave them meaning, these have been largely lost, overwritten by Christian interpretation. The individual identities of most of those buried there have been forgotten, their names unread for centuries, their stories reduced to bare facts in inscriptions. The physical structures themselves suffered damage when their roofs were removed and their interiors filled with earth during Constantine's construction project. Yet, in another sense, the burial beneath the basilica preserved what would otherwise have been destroyed. Had the necropolis remained open and accessible, it would likely have been gradually dismantled over the centuries, its materials recycled for other buildings, its decorations defaced or removed, its graves disturbed by later burials or by treasure seekers. The very act of covering it, of sealing it away, protected it from these fates. The tombs endured because they were forgotten, survived because they were buried. This suggests something about how history persists. What we remember is constantly being shaped and reshaped by present needs and concerns. Stories are retold, monuments are reinterpreted, sites are given new meanings that serve current purposes. This process of active remembering is necessary and inevitable, but it also transforms and simplifies, reducing complexity to manageable narratives, emphasizing some aspects of the past while downplaying others. What gets forgotten, paradoxically, may be preserved more faithfully, protected from the distortions of constant reinterpretation simply by being left alone. The necropolis was protected by obscurity. No one was actively preserving it because no one knew it was there. It simply persisted, untouched and unchanged, holding its secrets in darkness. When it was finally rediscovered, when human eyes saw those tombs again after 16 centuries, the site had not been altered to fit anyone's agenda or interpretation. It was what it was, a fragment of the past that had escaped the present's constant revisions. Of course, once rediscovered, the necropolis immediately became subject to interpretation and use. The Catholic Church claimed it as confirmation of tradition. Archaeologists studied it for what it revealed about ancient Rome. Tourists visited it as a curiosity. Each group brought their own interests and assumptions, their own ways of making the site meaningful. The necropolis could not remain neutral or uninterpreted. It had to mean something to the present, or it would remain merely an archaeological curiosity, interesting only to specialists. And so the necropolis lives on, not as it was in the 1st through 4th centuries, when families visited their ancestral tombs and mourners walked its funerary road, but as something new, a historical site that is also a sacred space, a window into the past that is also part of present religious life. It has been transformed by rediscovery, just as it was transformed by burial, given new purposes and meanings while retaining its physical form. The people buried there, those 1,000 or more individuals whose remains still rest beneath the basilica floor, have been conscripted into narratives they could never have imagined. The pagan Romans who built tombs for themselves and their families now lie beneath one of Christianity's most important churches. Their graves, part of the foundation for a religion many of them never knew, the early Christians who chose burial there because of Peter's supposed presence, now share that space with pagan neighbours they might have shunned in life. All of them, regardless of their beliefs or intentions, have become part of a story much larger than their individual lives, supporting meanings and purposes that emerged long after their deaths. This is how history works, perhaps. The past does not remain fixed but is constantly being reinterpreted, put to new uses, made to serve present needs. The dead cannot speak for themselves, cannot object to how they are remembered or what their lives are made to mean. They persist only in whatever traces they left behind, in bones and stones and fragmentary inscriptions that others must interpret. And each interpretation is shaped by the interpreter's own time and place and purposes, making history always a conversation between past and present, between what was and what we need it to have been. As we near the end of our journey through the necropolis, it seems fitting to reflect on what this place reveals about memory itself, about how civilizations remember and forget, about what persists and what vanishes when ages turn and worlds are remade. The Vatican necropolis is, in the end, a monument to the fragility and persistence of human memory, to our eternal struggle against oblivion and our inevitable partial failure in that struggle. Consider the layers of memory embedded in this site. First, there are the memories of the dead themselves, memories now completely lost, the inner lives of 1,000 individuals who once thought and felt and experienced the world. Whatever they knew, whatever they remembered of their own lives and times, all of that vanished when they died. Their consciousness, that unique perspective on existence that made each of them a person, dissolved into nothing, leaving only physical remains and the brief notations of inscriptions. Then there are the memories of those who knew them, who mourned them, who visited their tombs and spoke their names. These memories persisted longer, perhaps for a generation or two, as children remembered parents and grandchildren remembered grandparents. But eventually those mourners died too, and the memories they carried died with them. The tombs remained, but the living connection to the people they commemorated was severed. The dead became names without stories, ages without contexts, ancestors without descendants who remembered them personally. For centuries, while the necropolis remained accessible, some form of collective memory may have persisted. Families may have maintained records of who was buried where, may have continued to visit tombs even when personal memory of the deceased had faded. The physical site itself served as a memory aid, a place where the past remained present, where continuity with ancestors could be maintained through ritual and care. But this too eventually ended when Constantine's builders buried the cemetery beneath the basilica platform. At that moment, a different kind of memory took over. The necropolis ceased to be a living memorial and became instead a buried foundation, remembered only in the abstract, as a fact of history rather than as a lived connection to the past. Literary sources mention that there had been a cemetery on Vatican Hill, that Constantine had built over it, but no one could see the tombs, walk among them, read the inscriptions. The site existed in cultural memory as an idea, but the physical reality was sealed away, inaccessible. And so for 16 centuries the necropolis existed in a state between memory and forgetting. Not entirely lost, because tradition and texts preserved the knowledge that it had existed, but not truly remembered either, because it could not be experienced, could not be revisited, had become merely a chapter in books rather than a place in the world. The dead who rested there were as forgotten as if their tombs had been destroyed entirely, their names unread, their stories untold, their graves untended. The rediscovery in the 20th century marked yet another transformation of memory. The necropolis returned from abstraction to physical reality, from historical fact to experience place. Suddenly it was possible again to walk where ancient mourners had walked, to see decorations created 2,000 years ago, to read inscriptions carved by hands long turned to dust. The dead were not resurrected, their memories not recovered, but their monuments were restored to view, given new life in a changed world. Yet this restoration of memory is partial and selective. We remember now the necropolis as an archaeological site, as evidence for studying the past. We remember it as the supposed burial place of Peter, as a sacred site of Christian origins. But we do not remember it as the Romans who built it intended it to be remembered, as a cemetery where specific individuals deserved specific commemoration, where family relationships and personal achievements warranted preservation. Those individual memories, the ones that mattered most to the people who created the tombs, remain lost. This pattern repeats throughout history. What we remember of the past is never what past people hoped we would remember. The Roman Empire is remembered for military conquests and political dramas, for emperors and senators whose names appear in chronicles. But the ordinary people who constituted the vast majority of the empire's population, who worked its fields and staffed its shops and raised its children, they are forgotten almost entirely, known only through fragmentary evidence that scholars must painstakingly reconstruct. The necropolis allows us to remember some of these ordinary people, but only barely, only partially. We have their names sometimes. We know they existed, that they lived and died and were mourned, but we do not know them in any meaningful sense. They remain strangers, shadows, abstractions represented by bones and stones, and formulaic inscriptions. The richness of their actual lives, the texture of their daily experiences, the unique qualities that made each one a distinct individual, all of this is gone beyond any possibility of recovery. And yet, there is something powerful in even this fragmentary remembrance. To know that someone named Gaius Valerius Felix lived 62 years and worked as a grain merchant. To know that someone named Cornelia Severa died at 33, leaving behind a grieving husband. To know that someone's unnamed child died at age 7 and was mourned as a sweet soul taken too soon. this is more than nothing. These people existed. They mattered to someone. They left traces, however faint, on the world. And now, 2,000 years later, we can speak their names again, can acknowledge that they were here, can give them a moment of recognition before we too pass into forgetting. The necropolis thus becomes a meditation on mortality and memory, on what endures and what dissolves, on the human need to be remembered and the universe's indifference to that need. We build tombs and carve names and create monuments because we cannot bear the thought of complete obliteration, cannot accept that our lives will leave no mark, cannot imagine a future in which we never existed at all. But the necropolis shows us that our efforts at preservation are only partially successful, that memory fades and meanings change, and eventually even the most carefully constructed monuments become something other than their creators intended. Still, partial success is better than total failure. The people in the necropolis achieved something through their tombs, not immortality, not the preservation of their full selves and stories, but at least this, a physical trace that persisted long enough to be rediscovered, to be studied, to allow future generations some small glimpse into their world. They exist now as evidence, as data points in scholarly studies of ancient Rome, as context for Christian origins, as proof that ordinary people once lived and died and hoped for remembrance. This may not be the immortality they dreamed of, but it is a form of persistence nonetheless. Their bones rest where they were laid nearly 2,000 years ago. Their tombs still stand, weathered but intact. Their names can still be read, their ages still known. They have outlasted empires and religions, survived transformations they could never have imagined, and emerged into a world utterly unlike the one they knew. In that survival, however partial and transformed, there is something almost miraculous, a testament to the stubborn persistence of human traces against the grinding passage of time. The Vatican necropolis exists as a kind of archaeological palimpsest, a site where multiple layers of history and meaning are compressed into a single physical space. To stand in those dim corridors beneath the basilica is to experience history not as a linear progression, but as a vertical accumulation, with each layer bearing the weight of those above it while resting on those below. This layering, this stratigraphy of time and culture and belief, may be the necropolis's most important lesson, its deepest teaching about how civilizations build upon and bury their predecessors. At the bottom, literally and figuratively, lie the pagan Romans of the 1st through 3rd centuries, those freedmen and merchants and families who built tombs along Vatican Hill in the ordinary course of their lives. They were not thinking about posterity in any grand sense, not imagining that their graves would become foundations for world historical events. They simply wanted what all humans want, a decent burial, a preservation of memory, a way for their names to persist after their bodies failed. Their tombs were modest expressions of universal human needs, built according to the customs and beliefs of their time. Above that pagan foundation, in both chronological and metaphorical terms, comes the layer of early Christianity, the slow conversion that brought new beliefs and new symbols into the existing cemetery. This layer does not replace the pagan one, but overlaps with it, creating that complex mixture we have explored, where fish symbols appear alongside peacocks, where Christian inscriptions share walls with pagan epitaphs, where the old and new exist in uneasy but genuine coexistence. This is not conquest, but infiltration, not replacement, but transformation, a gradual change that occurs family by family, tomb by tomb, over generations. Then comes the Constantinian layer, the moment of imperial Christianity when the necropolis is buried beneath the first basilica. This is a more violent transformation, a decisive break that physically covers the earlier layers, that makes the cemetery invisible and turns it into foundation. What had been a living site of memory and ritual becomes inert structure, its original purposes superseded by new meanings centered entirely on Peter and Christian origins. The many are sacrificed to the one, the ordinary subsumed into the sacred. Above the Constantinian basilica rises the medieval and Renaissance church, that massive structure rebuilt over centuries, incorporating new architectural styles and artistic visions, accumulating ever more layers of meaning and significance. By this point, the original necropolis is so deeply buried, so far removed from living memory, that it has become almost mythical, a vague historical fact that no one can verify or experience directly. The layers above it are so heavy, so complex, so laden with their own histories and meanings, that what lies beneath seems irrelevant except as foundation. And finally, at the top of this accumulated stratigraphy comes the 20th century and the archaeological excavation, the moment when the lowest layer is partially revealed again, when a portion of the necropolis returns to view and is given new meanings for a modern world. The dead are rediscovered, the tombs re-entered, the inscriptions read again. But they are interpreted now through lenses that would be incomprehensible to those who built them, made to serve purposes they never imagined, incorporated into narratives of sacred history and archaeological science that bear little relation to their original contexts. Each layer in this stratigraphy both preserves and transforms what lies beneath it. The early Christian layer preserved the pagan tombs by using them, by adapting them rather than destroying them. The Constantinian layer preserved the necropolis by burying it, by sealing it away from the destructive effects of continuous use and exposure. The Renaissance basilica preserved the Constantinian foundations by building on them, and the 20th century excavation preserved what it discovered by documenting it, studying it, and carefully controlling access to it. Yet each layer also obscures and reinterprets. The Christian symbols added to pagan tombs change how we read those tombs, making it impossible to see them purely as pagan spaces. Constantine's burial of the necropolis erases its function as cemetery, transforming it into something else. The Renaissance basilica, with its grandeur and theological weight, makes it almost impossible to remember that beneath all that magnificence lie the modest graves of ordinary people. And modern scholarship, with its categories and methodologies, imposes its own frameworks on the evidence, finding what it looks for and sometimes missing what it does not expect. This is how cultural memory works, always a process of selection and interpretation, of emphasizing some aspects of the past while de-emphasizing others, of making the past meaningful to the present by shaping it to fit present needs and concerns. We cannot recover the past as it actually was, cannot experience it from the inside as those who lived it did. We can only approach it through layers of subsequent interpretation, each layer adding its own distortions and insights, its own truths and misunderstandings. The necropolis, in its layered complexity, becomes a metaphor for this process. We stand at the top of the accumulated strata and try to see down through them to the bottom, to the original moment when the tombs were built and the dead were buried. But our view is always partial, always filtered through everything that came between. We see the necropolis through Constantine's decisions, through Renaissance theology, through modern archaeology. We cannot see it directly, cannot strip away the layers to reveal some pure original truth beneath. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the layers themselves are the truth, the accumulated history of how different ages understood and used this space. The necropolis is not just the first century tombs, but everything that happened to them afterward, all the ways they were buried and preserved and forgotten and rediscovered, all the meanings they acquired and lost, and acquired again. To understand the necropolis fully is to understand it as a palimpsest, as a site where history is written over and over, each inscription partially obscuring but never completely erasing what came before. This understanding has implications beyond the specific case of the Vatican necropolis. It suggests that all historical sites, all monuments, all places where the past persists into the present are similarly layered, similarly complex. We cannot interpret them simply, cannot reduce them to single meanings or purposes. They are always multiple, always bearing the marks of their full history, always speaking in many voices at once. It suggests too that our relationship to the past is never simple or direct. We are always approaching it through layers of interpretation, always seeing it through the lenses of our own time and place. Historical understanding is not a matter of peeling away those layers to reveal some objective truth beneath, but rather of recognizing the layers themselves, of understanding how each age has shaped and reshaped what came before, of seeing the full complexity of how the past becomes present. The necropolis, then, is not just about ancient Rome or early Christianity or Constantine or medieval faith, or Renaissance grandeur or modern archaeology. It is about all of these at once, about how they interact and overlap and transform each other. It is about the weight of history, the way each age must bear the burden of what came before, while adding its own weight for future ages to bear. It is about memory and forgetting, preservation and transformation, about how the past persists in forms that would surprise and perhaps dismay those who first created it. And so we come to the end of our journey through the Necropolis, descending one last time in imagination to those dim corridors beneath St. Peter's Basilica, standing once more among the ancient tombs where 1,000 souls rest in eternal silence. What lessons can we carry away from this place? What wisdom gleaned from these brick walls and faded mosaics, from these bones and inscriptions that have outlasted empires? Perhaps the first and most fundamental lesson is about humility, about recognizing our own place in the vast sweep of time. The people buried in the Necropolis thought, as we all do, that their world was permanent, that the structures they knew would endure forever, that their beliefs and customs were fixed points in an otherwise changing universe. The pagan Romans could not have imagined that their gods would be forgotten, their temples abandoned, their entire religious system swept away by a faith that in their time was a marginal sect. The early Christians who added fish symbols to family tombs could not have foreseen that their modest cemetery would be buried beneath one of the world's greatest churches, that their simple faith would become an institution of immense power and complexity. We make the same mistake they did. We assume our world is permanent, our beliefs self-evident, our institutions eternal. But the Necropolis reminds us that everything passes, that civilizations rise and fall, that what seems immutable in one age becomes obsolete in another, that the mighty are humbled, and the forgotten are sometimes remembered again in ways no one expected. This is not cause for despair, but for perspective, for understanding that we too are part of long processes of change that we can neither fully comprehend nor control. The second lesson is about the value of ordinary lives, about recognizing that history is made not just by emperors and apostles, but by countless unnamed individuals whose daily existence, multiplied across millions, constitutes the true substance of any civilization. The Necropolis honors these ordinary people, gives them voice however faint, acknowledges that their lives mattered even if their names are now largely forgotten. In an age that celebrates celebrity and individual achievement, that focuses relentlessly on the exceptional and the dramatic, the Necropolis reminds us that most of what matters in human life is ordinary, that the real work of civilization is done by people whose names will never be remembered, but whose collective efforts make everything else possible. Think of those freedmen merchants moving grain through Rome's markets, ensuring that the city's population was fed. Think of those craftsmen making pots and tools and decorations, the accumulated labour of millions of such workers, creating the material culture we call Roman civilization. Think of those mothers raising children, those families maintaining households, those ordinary people living unremarkable lives that nonetheless added up to something larger than themselves. They deserve to be remembered, and the Necropolis, in its modest way, remembers them. The third lesson is about complexity and nuance, about resisting the temptation to simplify the past into neat narratives of triumph and defeat, of good and evil, of clear transitions from one age to another. The Necropolis shows us that religious change was messy and gradual, that pagan and Christian coexisted for centuries, that people held multiple beliefs simultaneously, that the boundaries between faiths were porous and constantly negotiated. This is not the story we usually tell about Christianity's victory over paganism, but it is closer to historical truth than any tale of sudden conversion or dramatic conquest. In our own time, when we are constantly tempted to reduce complex issues to simple oppositions, to see the world in binary terms of us versus them, right versus wrong, progress versus decline, the Necropolis offers a different model. It shows us that reality is always more complicated than our categories, that people are capable of holding contradictory beliefs, that change happens through adaptation and synthesis, rather than through wholesale replacement, that what seems like clear victory often conceals continuities and survivals that complicate any simple narrative of transformation. The fourth lesson is about the relationship between power and memory, about how those with authority shape what is remembered and what is forgotten. Constantine's decision to build his basilica over the Necropolis was an act of power that literally buried one kind of memory to create another. The ordinary dead of the cemetery were made invisible so that Peter, or the tradition of Peter, could be elevated and magnified. This is how power works, through control of narrative and memory, through the ability to decide which stories matter and which can be relegated to obscurity. Yet the necropolis also shows us that power's control over memory is never total, that what is buried can be rediscovered, that forgotten voices can speak again if someone listens. The 20th century excavation was an act of recovery that gave back visibility to what had been hidden, that restored complexity to a story that had been simplified, that reminded us that beneath every grand narrative of sacred history lie countless individual stories that complicate and enrich our understanding. Finally, the necropolis teaches us about our own mortality and what we might hope for beyond it. We will all die, and most of us will be forgotten, our names lost, our stories untold, our graves eventually untended. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is truth nonetheless. Yet the necropolis suggests that complete oblivion is not inevitable, that traces persist, that if we are very lucky and if circumstances align, something of us might survive to speak to future ages in ways we cannot predict or control. The people buried beneath St. Peter's achieved a kind of immortality they never sought. They wanted to be remembered by their families, to have their graves tended by descendants, to persist in the memory of those who knew them. Instead, they were forgotten for 16 centuries and then rediscovered by strangers who study them for reasons utterly foreign to their original intentions. This is not the immortality they desired, but it is persistence nonetheless, a survival that allows us 2,000 years later to know they existed, to speak their names, to honour their memory in however imperfect a fashion. And so, as you drift now towards sleep, let the necropolis settle in your thoughts like dust falling in those dim chambers beneath the basilica. Let yourself imagine those 1,000 souls resting in their tombs, the weight of history pressing down on them, the great church rising above them, the living world continuing its restless course while they remain in timeless stillness. They were human as you are human. They loved and grieved and hoped as you do. They died as you will die. And yet they persist, not in the form they hoped for, but in the only form available to them, as witnesses to a vanished world, as voices speaking faintly across vast distances of time, as reminders that every age, including our own, will someday be ancient history, buried beneath the accumulating weight of future centuries, waiting in darkness for someone to remember. Sleep now and rest in peace, as the inscription says, in pace. The dead beneath the Vatican have found their peace, whatever it may be. May you find yours as well, in this moment, in this quiet hour, as the necropolis releases you from its shadows and lets you go.